Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I'm a fan of classic movies.
Hello and welcome to Overlapping Dialogue, a podcast of double features dedicated to programming the finest, most eclectic, and downright bizarre film pairings and cataloging the discussions that ensue. We're your gruesome twosome, Kyle and Levi Huffman. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Levi.
And here we are again, back, ready for episode 89. We're getting on up there. Episode 89 of Overlapping Dialogue. We're still going through the 90s. This is the penultimate episode.
I thought it was 79, ain't it?
Let's check on this.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I think you're right, actually. Yeah, because I was thinking about... We recently actually sat down and organized what the next 10 are going to be, and yeah, I just remembered, it is 79. So, already off to a thrilling start of inaccuracies. And what better way to honor the movies today with inaccuracies than with The Last Days of Disco from 1998 and American History X, also
American History
98.
X. In fact, let's go ahead and put that clip.
Yeah,
right
I don't want to have to be doing that a lot, so let's
now.
go ahead and do it here.
American History X.
That was a low-key shocking moment in the movie because
And
I actually didn't know that was
You
going
say
to
that it's
be
not going to happen a lot, but I foresee.
Well, as the editor of the
possibilities.
podcast, I would like to limit the amount of times I'm
We'll
going to have to
see.
do that.
We'll just have to see about that.
These are two very different movies.
Yeah.
However, I don't want to make too big a deal about this, but one random thing I thought about after... Now, again, we said this last week. We had seen The Last Days of Disco before. This was our first time watching American History X. Mm-hmm. One thought I did have watching these two in close proximity is obviously the subject matters are very, very different. However, they are both portraits of whiteness.
Yeah.
And not only portraits of whiteness either... A, in decline, or B, with some sense of nostalgia in the moment or after the moment. Obviously, American History X is a much more explicit, racially charged way. Last Days of Disco, little's talked about with regards to race and ethnicity, but I do actually find, and we will talk about this when we get to the movie, that obviously... disco as a phenomenon was huge in African American and Latin American communities, and that this movie's almost a commentary. By the time white people really got to it and fell in love with it, it was starting to be a little bit in decline as a phenomenon. Obviously, it's come back in a way, even by the late 90s when the movie was made. But I mean, obviously, again, the subject matters are very different, but there is a weird similarity with regards to that I don't even think we really identified ahead of time, but after watching these I was like, they're both portraits of whiteness in various ways. But I'll go ahead and tell you, the Blue Plate special which awaits us is not going to have a lot going on because we've kind of been in the midst of preparing for the new school year. I know we're recording this on Sunday, August 27th. I know the podcast will be dropping on September 1st, so by then we'll be a week into school, but we're getting ready to prepare. Levi, I'll be starting year 3. I'll be starting year 5. Hard to believe the time's passed already this quickly, but that's life. But we do got an item or so to get in, so get ready. It's time for the Blue Plate special.
Hi, Audrey.
Norma, have a cup of coffee, please.
Sure.
I'll have what she's having.
Hey, who wanted a large pepperoni?
Dracula's smorgasbord because he ran out of a slave is right here. I don't know how to what would you call her? I guess that's just a blood slave.
Concubine. I don't know.
know.
Yeah, blood slave. That sounds like some punk band name.
Like audio slave or whatever.
Yeah. We didn't really write down. Just briefly touch on. There's actually been several big deaths recently. We don't have to dedicate too much time to talking about these, but
it's usually this time of year. Summer just kills people. I'm telling you.
Two actually in the wrestling world. Terry Funk.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And Bray Wyatt, also known as Wyndham Rotunda.
And The Fiend and
Uncle Howdy.
Yeah,
it has all kinds of things. Well, briefly touch on Funk.
Yeah.
He's someone that I've always been aware of for a long, long time. I think by the time I started paying attention to wrestling in the late 90s, early 2000s, he was obviously older and not doing as much stuff by then. But he's kind of known as one of the, quote, hardcore legends.
Yeah, I mean, because he mainly was known in ECW, and then he was in some stuff in the late 90s.
His career goes back to like the mid to late
WWE.
60s, though, I know, as far as how long he's been around. And I know when I first heard the news, my immediate reaction was thinking about his cameo appearance in the Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind, a.k.a. Mick Foley, who he had a lot of interactions and matches with. I mean, him getting choke slammed out of his shoes in that match.
We've been talking a lot recently about that is J.D. McDonough. Like, you know, like
JD,
Michael
don't
Cole
Google
saying
me.
that.
Yeah.
Like, that's a version of the ultimate version of that, I think, is after Mankind gets thrown off the cell towards the very beginning, and everybody's coming out to look at him, and then Jim Ross says, "There's Terry Funk." Like, that's just something I think about all the time, because I remember when I first saw that, I had no idea who Terry Funk was at that time when I had first seen that, and so I always thought for a long time of Terry Funk as like, oh, Terry Funk's here. And what's even weirder was he wasn't dressed up like in his Chainsaw Charlie garb or any of the stuff he would normally do. So he was literally just a guy.
Yeah.
Oh, Terry Funk's here, and he's got a ponytail and a hat.
It is wild to see.
New Balance shoes, like, you know, and it's just like, who is this guy?
Some of the clips from him in his ECW era, how old
he
was by that
old,
point, and the stuff that he's doing. It's just like, oh my God.
Like, but yeah, and then they're like, come on, Terry, get him up. But, yeah,
and then he takes his hat off and throws it.
So that's all before Mankind gets back up. You know, because the real story is there in the aisleway, as we know. By the way, we've seen that, like everybody, we've obsessed over that match for the past 20 years since I've known about it, and it truly is something else. And if you haven't seen it, the Undertaker Mankind Hell in a Cell match at King of the Ring 1998. If you're like,
was it in Pittsburgh? I think.
Yeah, it's Pittsburgh. Yeah. Pittsburgh is hell tonight, like, or whatever. Hell is in Pittsburgh.
I think if you're listening to this, like, why the hell are they talking about wrestling? This is one of those things that even people that don't know about wrestling kind of know about this.
Right. So it's like, if you're like, I don't care about wrestling, go watch that one match because it's something else. I've showed parts of it to people in my life here and there who don't know anything about wrestling, and they're literally, their eyes are wide open, like, what? Like, because some of it you can fake, here and there, where you could say, oh, there might be a little bit of that, and then there's other parts you're like, no. But anyway, that's after Mankind gets thrown then back down through the cell,
which apparently was worse for him.
Yeah,
I don't think it looks as bad on camera, but it was worse for him. Than
the thing is too is, I mean, as bad as getting thrown through the table at least cushioned the fall even slightly.
Yeah,
he literally hit that mat is like concrete, or that ring is like concrete, or whatever. And he also, I think, hit his head on the chair when he was coming down through it too.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he's laying there, and Terry Funk comes in, and he's like, throws his hat down like, Undertaker, I'm through with you.
Yeah.
And then the Undertaker, who literally just after breaking his foot from jumping down through the cell, choke slams Terry Funk out of his own shoes.
Yeah,
so,
and the way he shakes
right,
and goes on. It's like, I also love too, like when Undertaker first hits and the crowd goes like,
they're like, clapping, come on, Terry. Yeah. By the way, I know we're talking too much about this match and not enough about Terry Funk, but that is the Terry Funk moment for us. Is that whole thing?
Well, also to mention. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that we want to know if you are that random woman who screamed in that match when the cell was coming back down.
Please let
us know who you are.
I wonder if there's on wrestling Reddit if they figured out who that is.
Because it's literally that part where it's like, now I don't want to make any promises, but we're gonna. As a matter of fact, let's just put the audio here of that. I'll make sure we find it and put it in, because to explain it would be harder than to just hear it. Look out! So hopefully you heard that.
Yeah.
We're not sure, but like, it's like, what happened? Like, was there a murder going on? Like, what? I don't know. A lot of question marks.
Yeah.
But anyway, Terry Funk.
But again, also he appeared in movies here and there. I know he was in the Sylvester Stallone wrestling movie from the 70s, Paradise Alley, which kind of has a cult following. Most notably, he was in Roadhouse. He's one of
Dad,
bouncers in that. What's funny is that he looks older than Patrick Swayze does, but I guess just because he's lecturing them or whatever.
He looks almost as old as... Well, no, because he's talking to Sam Elliott.
Oh, no, that's right.
I was going to say, he looks almost
yeah.
as old as Sam Elliott, though,
Yeah, you're right.
Because Sam Elliott always looked older than he actually was.
Had gray hair, younger
but
age.
it's funny, it's like, they're probably about the same age, actually, but, yeah. Anyway.
But, like, I've actually seen more and more clips of Funk's career over the last few days and been like, oh, wow, like... he's one of those figures that's always been in the background or kind of, but he's seen a lot of sea changes in pro wrestling.
Yeah.
Just briefly also touch on the death of Bray Wyatt. He's somebody that, again, I've got into wrestling again a lot more recently, just since he's been out, so I've not really been watching much of him. But all the clips and stuff I've seen of him have been like, wow, this is definitely different and definitely on its own island of reality.
Yeah.
That, again, is... And everybody's talked about how creative and what a good soul he was, and how he was one of the most likable people behind the scenes. So it's very tough to hear.
I'd like to say briefly about when I first ever saw who he was back, it's been almost 10 years ago, actually. It was, I think, the Monday after Easter one year. I think it was like 2013, actually. Or no, let's see, when was that? No, 2014. It was 2014, and he that was when he was in his whole thing with John Cena, and I had no idea who he was, but that was when he was like wearing a hat and was like, it's almost like he was like doing slam poetry or something.
Yeah,
and it was just like him ranting and going on he kept saying John, like, and it was just so weird.
He has a very different, interesting sounding voice.
Yeah, and I just remember seeing that and literally sitting there like, what is this? Like, because that was at a time when I wasn't really watching a whole lot of wrestling, but I just flipped over there because I was on spring break and I didn't have anything to do, and I was watching that and I was literally like, what is this? I have no idea what this is. Like, so confused. And I'll say everything I've ever seen from him, I've never been the biggest fan of.
Yeah.
Because as I've gotten older, really post Undertaker, I'm overall relatively disinterested in that kind of wrestling. Just personally, I'm just not as interested in the supernatural or the
It seems like he's really been the only one who's really tried to do that kind of thing post Undertaker.
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, there's been versions of that, but obviously Kane was a version of that too. I like, but it just feels like a gimmick to me that doesn't. I'm just not as interested in at this point. So it's fine because he was one of the few who was actually doing that. That's just something I'm not personally very interested in anymore. But I will say this, what was definitely different is, like Mick Foley had done, he has all these different kind of personas that clash with each other. And I'm sure he saw Mick Foley as a big, inspiration on as far as that.
I know he had some things to say about his death, about what a talented performer he was. I know.
So I haven't ever really seen him actually wrestle. I've always kind of just seen the promos,
and shoots,
and they're all really interesting. But like I said, that's just something I'm just not as personally interested in anymore. But he is definitely everything I've seen. It takes it even to levels that I don't think the Undertaker did, just based on the time.
Well, I think
now,
also too, there's certainly in
his
his more recent years, there's a more comedy element to it too, which adds a weird other layer of surrealness to it.
And but I remember when COVID happened and they were doing those shows. It was in March of 2020 when it was everything was starting to shut down, but it wasn't totally shut down yet. It was like they started saying, "Oh, we'll have this without crowds," that kind of stuff.
That's by the way, the most surreal era of wrestling to watch. Where
That's what I'm saying. Because then there was that time him and John Cena were in the ring and there was nobody there.
Yeah,
and he was like, they were having a conversation. He was like looking at him after he'd said something, and it was dead silent because the crowd wasn't there. And that's literally the single weirdest thing I think I've ever seen is like him, like looking at him, and John Cena has to act like there are people there, like it's just not just them standing in a totally empty arena, just like.
And there's other clips of that era too that almost is like, it almost feels like, I'm not even using this term lightly, like avant-garde theater, where it's just like these monologues.
Well, a lot of
people are acting,
and people called it Lynchian. I mean, they put the Twin Peaks music behind it and all kinds of stuff, which they do with wrestling all the time, randomly. But and then there was that whole match between AJ Styles and The Undertaker. That was that Boneyard match. Wasn't that WrestleMania? I think
so.
And there was no one there. Yeah. So it's just weird. And
it was shot like a movie, basically. That whole thing was very odd.
Because that wasn't even in a ring.
That was officially Undertaker's last WrestleMania match.
But with all that, that's just saying that it's weird because it was like there was no one there.
Yeah.
So it was just like dead silent, and it was just really strange.
Yeah.
And that makes you realize, like I said,
how much of that revolves around crowd.
Yeah, it's the same thing with like soccer or American football or whatever. That especially with soccer, I remember one time. This is all getting off topic, but we were watching the World Cup at school, which don't tell no one, but I mean, they were doing their work, and I kind of had.
Well, after decades of watching ACC tournament basketball,
the grandma substitute teachers played,
or main teachers,
right? But anyway, But anyway, so like I was just watching that, and I was like, I'll put it on mute, and y'all. And one of my students was like, "You don't watch soccer or you don't soccer, football, whatever. You don't watch that on mute."
Was that? Have you ever been in a bar or any restaurant
at the time,
in America?
but at the time I was like, whatever, that's what I'm going to do. But now that I have thought about that, I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's such a part of sports is the crowd and to hear the crowd. Not that, like I said, there are versions of that where that happens and you just put up with it. But all this is to say also just the immense crowd reaction that you watch more of it than me, but the SmackDown on Friday night got of, in memoriam of Terry Funk and Bray Wyatt.
Cody Rhodes gave a very moving, touching tribute to Terry Funk, who, of course, his dad, Dusty Rhodes, had a lot of interaction with. And then LA Knight, who's really been this big rising star over the last several months, cut probably the promo of his career that managed to talk about Bray Wyatt and also his rivalry with The Miz, which is going to be paid off.
Who's got as much sex appeal as a clogged toilet, by the way.
he said in an online-only after SmackDown talk or whatever. So he's saving that for the offline, stuff. So, but anyways, and he did this impression of The Miz that was pretty funny. I don't know if you've heard that. But anyways, I know that's a lot of talk about pro wrestling, and that's something I've been getting a lot more into yet again. Recently, so is two deaths and again but I think they too. I mean, we're not just bringing them up for that reason. I mean, Terry Funk was in some movies, and even in just being in the world of pro wrestling, Bray Wyatt had a very cinematic sensibility that transcended purely just being about the ring, in the ring, but all the promos and stuff he cut had a very cinematic quality.
I mean, Sister Abigail is the name of his finishing move. But yeah, just saying about him, like I said, even when I was kind of like, my mileage may vary on all this, it was always very, I always kind of subconsciously respected whatever all that was, and have thought more about it now than I did at the time. But
I was going to also bring up, I don't know if you heard about this. This happened recently. The voice of the original Harley Quinn actually passed away.
I didn't know that.
Her name is Arlene Sorkin. She was only 67 years old, but passed away. And again, she was one of the big voices, the first voice of Harley Quinn, which in Batman the Animated Series was the very, the introduction of that character. one of the greatest legacies, and weirdly also one of the most complicated legacies, actually, too, of Batman the Animated Series was the creation of Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is a diminishing return of a character ever since the animated series. I mean, I feel like that was her at her height. She's been introduced in the mainline comics, and then also in the Arkham video games, and obviously been now portrayed by Margot Robbie in movies. But that, to me, I think most people would agree, that's pure Harley Quinn, is that, and her voice, and what a personality behind the voice, and the specificity of that character, too. Anything come to mind when you think about Harley Quinn in general, or kind of Arlene Sorkin's rendition of that
I
voice?
think that's a good version of it. Also, the video games, the versions of it that Margot Robbie have done have not been, I think, particularly great. I mean, she's fine in it, but those movies just aren't that great. I mean, Birds of Prey actually was all right, but yeah, that's something that's kind of complicated anyway, and the whole idea of a
like a foil for the Joker,
right,
a romantic kind of relationship,
and
for
as
the
a
Joker.
Female, basically brainwashed.
Yeah,
which
as the character has been around longer, has been less of an aspect of it, that
right.
she's been more uncoupled from the Joker here or there.
Yeah.
Just a little bit about the backstory of Harley Quinn's creation. The character of Harley Quinn was based on Sorkin, after her college friend Paul Dini, who of course was one of the big writers of Batman the Animated Series, has written. I think he started off in Tiny Toons and he wrote a lot of children's TV, and then he got into Batman the Animated Series. He's one of the biggest writers to come from that show. He's also written Batman comics and other DC comics since then. Saw her play a jester from a dream sequence in the soap opera Days of Our Lives, which she was on. So that was initially the inspiration. Dini then based Harley Quinn on Sorkin, incorporating aspects such as mannerisms and very snappy, wisecracking, bubbly blonde personality. In recording Harley Quinn's voice, Sorkin spoke in her normal Brooklyn accent while putting in a little Yiddish sound, since Dini made the character Jewish, another aspect the character borrowed from Sorkin. I think that's a great story, because that right there tells you that it's not this generic villain that was created. It was actually created based out of a performer. Then it was fashioned for a performer to do, which only kind of proves my point, what I was saying about how much of the magic and the brilliance of that character comes from her rendition of it. So rest in peace to her as well. We only have one new movie to talk about.
Well, also Bob Barker died, we should say.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about saying that. Yeah, Bob Barker, who was age 99, passed away.
Like everybody's been saying, is close to 100 without going over.
I mean, how long was he on The Price is Right?
Lord, I don't know.
Let's see. Let's get this right. He was on it for a grand amount of time. Why does the internet decide just not to work when we want it to work? So he hosted The Price is Right from 1972 to 2007.
Dang. I figured it was the 60s and 70s.
But then I think he started back up again at one point. Let's see.
Well, Price is Right.
Never mind.
No,
I'm thinking of
because
somebody else.
Drew Carey did that.
I'm thinking. Also, speaking of wrestling, there was a time, I don't know if you remember seeing this, I remember it barely, where he partly hosted Raw, and there was like a whole segment
I heard about it,
where him and Chris Jericho got into it or whatever, of like playing Price is Right with some of the superstars. But anyways, Drew Carey replaced him. Said his last appearance was a surprise appearance on April 1st, 2015 for an April Fool's Day switch, where he took Drew Carey's place in the intro. He hosted the first bid and pricing game of that day before handing dues back to Carey. So it was, April Fools, haha, I'm back. I think also people who know him from movies are going to remember him, of course, from Happy Gilmore and his very famous legendary fight with... that
was one of the early YouTube hits,
Adam
like
Sandler.
everybody laughed at and watched on YouTube all the time. I mean, people had seen the movie and everything, but...
Just to briefly go over his life, which I don't know, frankly, all that much about. Said he was born in Darrington, Washington, in modest circumstances. Spent most of his youth on the Rosebud Indian Reservation and was enrolled as a enrolled member of the Sioux tribe. I had no idea he had a Native American ancestry. Joined the U.S. Navy Reserves during World War II. He was part-time in radio in college. Moved to California to pursue a broadcasting career. And then he did various things. He was involved in Miss Universe and Miss USA pageants before landing the dream gig, of course, of Price is Right. That's one of those shows that, to me, I don't actively seek out and watch like I used to, but I actually partly use some of it in my economics personal finance class. But that's always just a fun show to watch if you actually get back to watching it.
That show was such a part of our daily ritual, especially when we lived during the summer, when we would not live, but visited often, lived during the day at our great aunt and uncle's house.
No, Grandma watched it too.
Babysitted, And so that was just a normal thing. You watched Price is Right at 11 o'clock. I mean, every day.
And I've heard a lot of people talk about being sick at Grandma's house watching Price is Right as a shared cultural kind of phenomenon. But
the only show that still kind of has that sort of mystique now, other than shows that are on the Game Show Network, is Let's Make a Deal. Kind of is like that.
Well, that went back far too, and then kind of came back more recently.
And that has the whole thing of all the people dressing up real weird. And, but
I know this all reminds me of a story of and this seems so obvious, but it was interesting to hear it, of a kid I grew up in elementary and middle school with. His mom went out to California to go to and I think they were out there for other reasons, but they went to a Price is Right taping, and they were a part of the crowd for that. They said that they kind of ahead of the show put everyone in this kind of big kind of banquet hall area.
Yeah.
And that basically there were these scouts that were walking around that were from CBS and Price is Right, and they basically watched the people who had the craziest, most outsized behaviors, and those were the people that were picked to be on the show, which of course makes sense that that's what they would do. But I just always found that funny as a way to go, what freaks do we want to put on here today? People like to bash, it ain't as good as it used to be. Drew Carey does a perfectly fine job as the host of that show, I feel like.
Well, listen, I like Bob Barker, but it ain't brain surgery. I mean, anybody can do it. I could do it if I really wanted to, but whatever.
But they never called, so
no. They never said come on down.
Nonetheless, Bob Barker did have a very likable
Edward Nigma, come on down. You're the next contestant on Brain Drain. T-U-ah. Anyway.
That'd be a good password for somebody to use. I'm definitely not going to use it now because I've said it, but feel free to or I think like UHM TTEEOHH anyways.
Right.
All those individuals will be greatly missed in their respective ways.
You know who won't be missed is Dracula. Because it looked like we picked up Dracula.
So, one of the few new movies, this should be a chance for us to briefly talk about how Hollywood is still in strike, and there have been a lot of movies that have been delayed or put on hold. I think most angrily on most of Twitter, Dune being pushed to next year. You're a huge Dune fan, so I'd be curious to have your thoughts kind of broadcast on here on this. Got pushed I think March of 2024. Hollywood's not budging an inch right now, it seems like, when it comes to this strike. Not only is that putting a lot of people out of work, but that's also costing the theaters money.
Yeah.
Do you have any points of this, any ideas you'd like to share at this point in the strike process about
well, I'll start
what's going on or what it all means?
I'll start with Dune. Get over it. It'll come out. I mean, I don't know. It's just very performative anyway. I mean, and I've been thinking it's like the way that people are acting about this, they're probably... I wouldn't think that they would push back certain other movies. I think that movie, Warner Brothers is banking on making a lot of money out of, and it has a lot of big stars in it.
That they don't want to have off the press tour.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why that's happening, is that they're saying, we can't not have that.
Part of it is, too, for the studios, is that they know that things that were supposed to be coming out next year are now not going to come out because they've stopped shooting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that means that
there's going to be a big section.
There's going to be a gap.
Right. There's going to be a big section of next year where there's nothing. Which, as bad and as sad as that is, and as much as that will hurt the theaters even more, also I'm like, okay, well, whatever. I mean, also, it's like none of this, I can't do anything about any of this. So it's like, why am I going to get bent out of shape? But with Killers of the Flower Moon. I doubt that they'll cancel that one, mainly because the time is just getting so close anyway.
Well, I think we forget, too, it was supposed to come out last year.
Yeah, so it's just we're just doing that. But also, Scorsese would probably even be fine with the fact of, okay, I'll do the promotion, whatever, because he's kind of done that the last few movies anyway. Not that the stars haven't done it, but it's not like Dune where there's like a ton of people in it. I
think somebody the size of Leonardo DiCaprio, though, that could make a difference in terms of
but
promotion or not.
I don't know. That movie's probably not going to make a ton of money anyway. So, for some reason, Warner Brothers is banking on Dune to make a ton of money. I don't really know why.
Well, we talked about this in the past. Like, Dune was in this... There was a whole story about whether or not Dune was going to make enough to justify the sequel, and thankfully it did, and so we're going to get it. But that was a whole fear out of that first one, was it's not going to make enough.
Oh, and I've cemented it in granite at this point that there's no way they're making a third one. Like, everybody keeps acting like, oh, they're going to make Dune Messiah. No way, they're not doing that.
Well, I don't know what Denis Villeneuve's plans are, but I would imagine he's got other things he might be wanting to do.
Yeah, well, he said he wants to do that, but especially because it's getting pushed back and because it probably won't perform as well as they'd like, and also they're just going to have to do some massive restructuring franchise-wise to think about, do we really want to put money into this movie? Like, that whole thing. I doubt that movie will happen pretty strongly.
It should be said, in the midst of all this going on, that Barbie and Oppenheimer have remained strong in the theaters as far as box office draws. Barbie's crossed over $1 billion.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer's overperformed. So that it's ironic, as we've talked about in the past, that that's all going on in the midst of this strike.
Yeah.
Because they kind of like, both of those movies kind of prove theaters are back. And now we don't have anything to put in them. I'm actually Levi wrote a terrific essay and article about kind of the current state of movie theaters. I'm going to link in the description of this episode that I recommend everybody read, because you kind of used it as the jumping off point being the Sound of Freedom controversy and about movie theaters with that. But terrific piece from Levi that I'm going to put in the description for
Appreciate that. But, maybe what will happen, and as far as the strike goes, it is surprising, but I think if the actors and the writers can stick it out, they'll buckle eventually. The studios will have to, because they don't have anybody doing anything. They're going to keep losing money. It is strange it's going on this long, though. They really seem like they're committed to being a-holes. I mean, we already knew they were, but I have been surprised by that. But I think that the writers and the actors hopefully realize that it's now or never. Like, if we can't do this now and we give in now, they'll never...
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with residuals and AI. Thing about residuals are, this is one of the first big strikes that's happened in residuals in the streaming era. And so there's a whole question of what should residuals be for things that are streamed. And the major streaming companies like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, you name it, Disney Plus, whatever. There's a huge speculation that they are actually not getting nearly as much numbers to justify the number of projects they're sometimes putting out, so that they're afraid that if these numbers come out, that it's going to make them look bad, and then the stock price is going to drop, because the numbers of all the amount of things they're producing that then just go to streaming are not justifying.
Well, because
streaming.
There's so much.
You know why?
Stream.
Because for one thing, it's almost like movie theaters as a exhibition experience were great, and they kind of neglected that. And also, Blu-ray and DVD market is not what video used to be as a market. And I've heard Matt Damon talk about this before.
So all this stuff is just going there to die, basically.
Right, and that they're not making, and that they know if these numbers come out, that it's going to kind of reveal the emperor has no clothes, basically.
And then there's no residuals to be had because they don't exist, is what you're saying, right? That's a problem. But and that's the thing, the stuff that gets streamed is the biggest stuff, and then there's everything else. And it's like, it's not that I don't want to see some of those random things that go there, but at the same time, it's like, well, people don't watch those, though, that's probably also, that might even be why, a way to kind of figure it out now, why Warner Brothers has dropped so many things off their streaming services, because they don't want to pay all these residuals for things that aren't getting watched,
Right.
you know, and so that actually might make sense for that. I don't know. But yeah, it is very surprising, though, this has continued to go on. I thought it would be over by now, but
Yep.
I had heard, it seems like a month ago now, that they were going to get back to the drawing board and start talking again, but that hasn't happened, so I don't really know what the status of that is, or,
Yeah.
you know, it is hilarious that Bob Iger had said, it's just not realistic. It's like, okay.
And then people talking about how, I don't even remember what his salary is, but it's like,
Makes like $40,000 an hour or something.
something
like,
crazy
yeah.
like that. I don't remember what it is,
Yeah.
but it's just like, yeah, it's like, you know, it's public, you know, teachers in North Carolina, that's like what we make a year, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like whatever.
He doesn't do anything.
Speaking of
by the
blood-sucking
way.
vampires,
Yeah.
The Last Voyage of the Demeter, also known as Dracula, Voyage of the Demeter in some international markets, recently came out. This movie's a huge box office flop, or I don't know, define huge, I guess. It wasn't made for a huge amount
Well, I don't
of
know
money.
why anybody thought it would be.
It received mixed reviews from critics. It grossed $14.9 million worldwide against a budget of $45 million, making a box office flop. Now, this comes from Universal, who's been on a roll recently, who's been doing, not only financially, but I'd say creatively. I'd say they're really one of the best studios working now in Hollywood in terms of, especially like in the partnerships with Christopher Nolan, obviously with Oppenheimer, and also long-term with Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
That they're obviously creatively interested in actually doing some good things, which is kind of already puts
Can
you
I
in a-
jump back very quickly and talk about the strike again for a second? Because this just reminded me of something.
Yeah.
With Universal, that reminded me that we're going to go see American Graffiti on Wednesday. They're putting it back out for the 50th. And I was thinking, because it's a Universal movie, and I was thinking, you know what? Maybe what'll happen is they just have to start re-releasing movies again, like they did during COVID. And it's like, maybe I'll just go see a movie though, like because they can't make anything new. So it's like, okay, well, let's just get people to. Because I think they did that with Lord of the Rings for a little while, and then they were like putting certain movies back out and stuff.
Was that in late 2021 when it was the 20th anniversary, or was it just even before that? I can't remember.
It was around that time. I think it was kind of both. They were like, let's just do both. But speaking of things,
Harry Potter movies though for a while, I know too.
Yeah,
they were re-releasing some of them.
Right, but so speaking of things that have been re-released, Dracula again, or any movie that follows this format as a haunted house movie.
Its plot follows the doomed crew of the merchant ship the Demeter, led by Captain Elliot, who attempts to survive the treacherous ocean voyage from Transylvania to London while being stalked by a legendary vampire known as Dracula. What's fascinating is this is basically an adaptation of the Captain's Log chapter from Dracula by Bram Stoker. I always want to say Stoker. Excuse me. But I think this goes back to why this movie was kind of a flop. Is like it's kind of a weird duck in terms of being kind of a Dracula movie, but in an uncharacteristic environment for Dracula. Also, it just feels like it wasn't promoted all that strongly. Also, it's the end of summer, which always is where box office starts to fizzle out.
Well, that's what I was telling
anyways,
somebody asked me this the other day. They were like, "Are there any movies out right now?" I said, "No, not really." I said, "It usually gets like this time of year. They don't really have anything."
Because it's like right before the fall slate
and then they start putting everything out. Which will be, like I said, kind of weird this time around because it's like, well, are they going to put this stuff out or not? I mean, like I said, I know it's all about star promotion, but I don't know. You can get these movies out there anyway. People are going to go see them, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's also just to show that a lot of movies that have come out this year really haven't made money in general. And so that's just this whole question of, like, what does that mean? But yeah, so this movie is weird because it's, like you said, about a lot of random things that just don't really.
Real quick, let's just go through the box office of this year because I was curious to see what it was. As of now, Super Mario Brothers movie is still the highest grossing, but Barbie is not far behind. I'm even shocked that that's actually as close as it is.
Within $20 million, it looks like.
Yeah.
So
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. You see the difference, though, between those two movies, and then Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is less than $1 billion.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer is right now 700 and some million. Fast X, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Full River Red.
That's probably
Is that a Chinese movie?
yeah.
I know The Wandering Earth 2 is.
Those are, yeah.
Yes, it is a Chinese movie. Wandering Earth 2, Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1.
Yeah.
And
What's funny is that Dead Reckoning Part 1 is on that list, and yet it's been seen as a flop in its own way. Or not exactly a flop, but like a struggle.
Yeah.
You know, where it shouldn't have been. But yeah. And I don't know, it's weird because it's like, it's strange because you think, okay, the amount of money that gets spent on these big movies and then nobody goes to see them, and it's like, okay, that's an easy enough fix of stop making movies so expensive. But then you have movies even like this where it's like, okay, it wasn't like terribly, terribly expensive to make, but it still didn't make its money. So it's just one of those things where I guess, well, first of all, you just need to get more original, I guess, too. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer there is, but it's strange because, yeah, how much did Renfield make?
Renfield also was an underperforming movie. Also Universal, also about Dracula. $65 million was the budget. It made $26.7 million.
Yeah.
So Dracula is not in vogue right now.
Well, it's been done to death.
What did you think of this movie, though?
It's fine. I mean, it's literally exactly what you think it's going to be. I was a little bit shocked with certain decisions to go, oh, wow, you killed that person, or you did this, wow, you know.
Yeah.
Which sounds weird because you think, well, everybody died. Well, not quite, you know, obviously. But, yeah, it's just a very basic movie. I mean, I felt like there were some moments that were really thrilling visually. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's just.
I mean, it really felt like Alien meets Dracula. You know what I mean? It felt like, you know, the kind of a haunted house movie, but set on a ship, which I think is interesting. And I think the whole pitch for this movie sounds cooler than it is. And not that the movie's bad. I think the movie's fine. It's serviceable. It's passable.
Yeah.
But you know, it's like you see the trailer for it, and that's kind of as good as it gets in terms of the idea, the premise. And I think it could, I mean, I think it's like kind of exactly the best version of itself, but also I think if this was in the hands of another director, it could have been done even better at the same time, too. The director in question with this is Andre Orvidal. So he's actually most known for Troll Hunter, which is one of those movies I've always heard about and still yet to see.
Yeah, and it seems like after that he did a lot of American productions, you know, basic
The Autopsy
stuff.
of Jane Doe, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is an adaptation of those books.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think he's a competent director, but it just, I don't know, it feels like something you'd hear as a pitch, and maybe it wouldn't work good as a movie because that, I don't know, or great as a movie, but I think, I don't know, there's still something that could have been done a little better with this.
Yeah.
And again, it was interesting to see a section of the Dracula mythos that is normally skipped over actually be done in a bigger way.
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah, that's ultimately the reading on that. It's a fine enough movie, but why? And that's what, you know, most viewers or, you know, audiences didn't even bother to ask the question. They just didn't even care. So...
I just wondered, too,
which I also
anybody even
say,
knew about it.
Well, I should say also that this production... literally originated shortly after the Bram Stoker's Dracula
had
adaptation.
In developmental hell.
So it's been in developmental hell forever. So that never is good for a movie, especially now. It's like, no, you don't do that. But, well, it's been wanting to be made forever, so yeah.
Do you think, again, there is something to that in Renfield underperforming about what, quote, Dracula means right now in terms of
I mean,
as a commodity?
Yeah, just in general, this kind of stuff just doesn't matter to people anymore. And but why should it? It's been done every which way. I mean, but obviously we've talked about with Universal that they're doing that whole version of trying to update these, and we've seen that with The Invisible Man. But we haven't.
Fine.
And we haven't really seen that though with much else yet. There's been all these productions
Chloe Zhao, I think, was going to be
made.
doing a Dracula movie.
Yeah, and then there was going to be
Derek Cianfrance and Ryan Gosling doing
that
Wolfman, which I think now there's probably a good chance they'll have more juice after the success of Barbie with Ryan Gosling. Hopefully, so
that'll be a version of this. So yeah, there are things happening, but like I said, especially for a movie like this, if you're not going to update it much, then what really is the point of doing it?
Yeah.
Because this wasn't any update.
I do think this is an improvement of the Dark Universe's failure in terms of like, oh, we're going to make a big Marvel-style mythos and universe. And it's like, no, just do the movies.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Just like, why even get lost in that? That's not even working out awesome for Marvel at this point even either. So, you know.
Yeah, that's another thing. They're doing that. Basically, all the different versions of Captain Marvel movie.
Marvels, I think.
Marvels, yeah, and it's just like
coming out in like November or the fall.
No one wants to see that. It's gonna bomb.
Blue Beetle also is coming out around this time, and it's not done well either.
As we figured.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go see that. I just didn't go around to it. Just because why not, you know? But whatever.
But that's enough about all that. Here is the trailer for one of our movies for today, The Last Days of Disco.
I don't know, I'm not really a disco type. I probably wouldn't get in anyway.
Of course you'll get in. Holly's gorgeous.
Disco, this country was a dancing wasteland. You know the Woodstock generation of the 1960s that were so full of themselves and conceited? None of those people could dance.
I don't care. I don't want that element in the club.
Okay, I work in advertising. Is that a crime? What's happening in this country? I have a very bad feeling about the clubs. It's like a meteorite is headed straight for it. It's going to destroy everything.
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll be a meteorite.
Something deeply ingrained in human biology. Women prefer bad over weak and indecisive and unemployed.
I don't know about that.
You think they do prefer weak, indecisive, and unemployed?
What if in a few years we don't marry some corporate lawyer? What if we marry some meatball like you?
I just think it's so important to be in control of your own destiny.
Late at night, you find yourself with some awful guy with disgusting breath thrusting his belly up against you, trying to stick his slobbering tongue in your mouth. Ugh. Thank God this is a whole new era in music and social models. We're in complete control. There are a lot of choices out there.
People all over the world, everybody, join in. Start a love tree, love tree. People all over the world, join in. Come on, start a love tree, love tree. Come on, join in. Join in. Ride this train, y'all. Love tree, love tree. I'll set this world, join in. Come and see your way, love tree, love tree.
Love that trailer immediately kind of establishes what this movie is about in a very clear, direct way. You know,
it kind of reminds me, you know, a lot like those types of trailers for movies around this time. They've got all the zingers in there. They've got all the one-liners. Like, oh, you think women do like men that are unemployed or whatever? You know, like stuff like that. But obviously, this movie's a good, you know, version of that. But yeah, so The Last Days of Disco is a 1998 American comedy drama film written and directed by Whit Stillman, loosely based on his travels and experiences in various nightclubs in Manhattan, including, you know, most famously Studio 54. Starring Chloe Sevigny, Kate Beckinsale, the film follows a group of Ivy League and Hampshire College graduates falling in and out of love in the disco scene of New York City in the early 1980s. It should be noted there were some similar movies made around this time. I think there literally was a movie made called Studio 54, or no, it's called just 54, that was made the very same year. And that movie, I think, just barely made money. It was $16.8 million on a $13 million budget. I'm assuming it lost money on the, you know, advertising costs.
Yeah.
Mike Myers was randomly in that. And this movie, of course, being more independent anyway, only made $3 million out of $8 million budget. But
you know, it should be said in the late 90s there was a lot of 70s nostalgia, specifically.
Right.
I mean, that 70s show was taken off
Almost
around that
Famous
time.
is a version
Almost
of that.
Famous. I mean, so there's, and usually nostalgia works in 20-ish the 30th year cycle, so it was time to be nostalgic for the 70s around this time.
Well, this is in the early 80s, but
but it's the end of that era,
I'm saying that time period, and and like I said, that Studio 54 movie was probably part of that. But yeah, basically, also it should be noted this is that third film in the Metropolitan and Barcelona kind of trilogy.
But isn't it the second in terms of chronology?
I think so, because I think Barcelona was the last one, maybe. But yeah, what he calls his Doomed Bourgeoisie in Love series, which I'm just like, roll my eyes at. But yeah, like I said, they're all independent from each other except for appearances of some common characters. There's a lot of characters in Metropolitan that show up in this.
As background, effectively.
Right. And Barcelona, I think, is the most different of the group.
Yes.
But what's interesting about this too is that you think about these two movies, in Metropolitan and that Last Days of Disco, that kind of following the debutante season, whole idea of all these debutante balls and these rich young socialites.
Well, one of the things that I think about the most with that movie, that I think is part of what Whit Stillman's point or thematic juice is behind, and I'm going to butcher the exact iteration of this, but there's a point in that movie where one of the main characters says something along the lines of, "Oh, I don't read literature, I read the literary criticism about the literature instead." And I think that, like, again, in many ways, these movies are very much about Ivy League whiteness, and about people that didn't go to Ivy League schools and this upper crust Northeastern society, that they're just outside of that and they want to be in it, or they want to be part of this culture. And I feel like that alone sums up what a lot of these movies are about in terms of, that's why I've talked about this as a portrait of whiteness, because this perhaps is one of the whitest movies of all time. And I don't say that as a good thing or a bad thing, just simply as a thing that is. That this is very intensely about a white New York and a white society that's in flux of its own cultural Metropolitan, coming of age. Most specifically, Last Days of Disco. But I mean, those movies are all in their own way versions of this. But this one, I think, and we said this last time, one of the reasons I think this is the best out of those three movies is because of its sense of time and place is very present and very memorable, to the point where even if you were not there for that, you feel like you were just by virtue of seeing this.
And I think that but anyway, I was saying about those two movies, I think it's interesting too that one of them is like, it's almost like a passing of the torch in its own way of New York, of saying, oh, it used to be these kind of the debutantes and this and all these balls, and now it's disco. And then, there were things in between those two, and then there was nothing kind of by the end of that. Now, obviously, with Barcelona, kind of going along what you were saying, is basically about all these people that leave to go to Europe when they can't do things here,
which is implied as almost at the end of this movie that's what's going to happen to some of these characters.
Because that main character in Barcelona, played by Taylor Nichols, is in that as in Last Age of Disco as that character briefly.
And then Chris
Eggman
is in all who plays a different character in all these movies. But interestingly, there's a moment where it sounds like he's getting ready to go to Barcelona at the end of this movie. And then he doesn't. But then he does, effectively, because he plays another character. I just thought that was kind of a funny element.
But that basically that also implying with that movie that it's not any better there in Barcelona than it is in the United States for these kind of people. All that's to say that the movie's about disco specifically, but it's also just kind of about a lot of other things about New York and
I think he's using the world of a declining disco to comment on a certain generation's coming of age. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit with this movie, because I think oftentimes coming of age movies are set in people's teens. Because that's usually what we think of. You mentioned American Graffiti earlier in terms of a movie we're actually going to be seeing in theaters for a few days from now, which is very exciting, actually. Usually when we think of coming of age, we think of people in their early childhood years or through their teen years. there's a whole genre specifically of Gen X filmmakers made versions of this, whether it be this or whether it be Reality Bites, Ben Stiller's Reality Bites, which is quite good, another big 90s movie, that are about this kind of coming of age, but in one's 20s as opposed to one's early days. And you yourself, just yesterday, Levi Huffman, turned 25 years old on August 26th, so congratulations. Happy birthday, Levi.
Thank you.
But and I'm 30, I'm getting ready to be 31, but like, where these characters are at in this movie are very akin to places we ourselves are at, not literally in geography or location, but in terms of the questions one asks oneself about coming of age in their 20s, and that's very much, that's something that the before movies are about to a certain extent. There's a whole rich tapestry of movies set during that time. What do you think of these characters and their own arcs in relation to each other as kind of a coming-of-age portrait of in one's 20s during this time period?
I think that's very much, it's very a New York thing. But I think about this in people and we talk about these people in code a lot, but the triangle people, the people that go to the triangle. And
for us in North Carolina, that represents kind of Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill.
Right. There,
triangle.
or you go up to, or the people that go to New York.
Which is funny is that area weirdly is more of a New York than what Charlotte probably.
Yeah.
Some people characterize Charlotte as that, but for us, there's a lot of people our age that go to the Triangle and never come back.
Right, and so those types of people, I know those people very well, and like a lot of those people still in their own way, but that there's people that leave places like this to be that sort of thing. What's interesting, these people all probably grew up in New York, but I'm aware of these types of people, and they're all starting to get that age too, or past that age, And so that's this whole question I'm sure they ask themselves is, why am I here, or what am I doing, or whatever. But how
am I doing in comparison to everyone else?
Right.
My age is a subconscious thing that happens.
The people we're talking about, though, even have the benefit of saying, well, I'm not in Caldwell County anymore. I'm in, Raleigh or New York or wherever.
We're thinking about some very specific people.
Or Baltimore, if you want to be more specific. Just different people that move those places, or Boston or wherever.
Yeah.
But what's strange, but what's even more compelling is that these people are all conceivably from here in Last Days of Disco, and so they don't even get to go somewhere to be other than Barcelona, which is its own thing.
I think Sevigny's character of Alice and Kate Beckinsale, Charlotte, didn't it mention they went to college in New Hampshire, I think, and they might be more from a slightly outside of
Hampshire College in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Okay,
they mentioned that at one point. So they do seem a little bit more like outsiders, but I do think there are other characters that have been here for most of their lives, if not much.
There's a lot of these. And then there's, a whole thing about advertising and, what people's jobs are. A lot of them are in publishing, some are in advertising, and then the people who just work at the club, which is always funny to me, certain people, because, this is my favorite Chris Eggman performance, and I like him in everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he does good.
I feel like his most lead role in Barcelona. And then he's got a smaller role in... the first one, Metropolitan.
And that's a little more of like a Metropolitan's a little more of like the snarky supporting character who's totally an a-hole, and there's no. What I like about this is he is that in his own way, but he's a lot more like. It's weird. This movie, he feels a lot more like he's constantly defeated and constantly defending himself, but he's still that person. But
we should also mention he has his role in Kicking and Screaming, which is another huge movie of this era that is a contemporary movie of the 90s. That was big Noah Baumbach's kind of first big movie.
Right.
He himself is a patron saint of a similar world of this movie in its own way, too.
But so all that's to just say that with Chris Eggman, like I said, I really like him in this because he's a more interesting character, that he's not totally acerbic. He is, but he's more in defense all the time, and that's interesting.
And he's someone who basically manages and runs the club on a daily basis, which is just kind of called the club, right? I don't think it really
never call it anything.
Yeah, basically they call it the club or refer to it as the club. But he has kind of this funny recurring arc of
an
like
exclusive disco nightclub. It doesn't even say where it
that
is.
he, he gets in relationships with women, either abandons or cheats on them, is confronted with that, and then uses for an excuse. Oh, I think I'm gay.
Yeah.
And then like turns that on. They're like, oh, I'm sorry, and like he kind of plays it off in this tragic way, like thank you for being part of my journey to understand that. And then immediately turning around and like ignoring them.
Well, it's funny though.
Like,
there was a scene where a woman was like confronted him again about it, and was like, "So he's like, you said, but you're not actually gay." He's like, "But I might be." It's like,
but I might be.
It's like constantly like, "But I could be. I could be gay." Yeah. It's like, But yeah, do you feel the need to go through all of these actors necessarily? Or,
we can just briefly talk about go through them very quickly. I feel like our leads are obviously
Savigny and Beckinsale. We talked about Savigny earlier with kids.
This is a much better film.
Yeah,
and we said one of the highlights of that movie, if there is such a thing, is her performance or her presence. She obviously gets way more to do in this.
Right.
It's more based
seems
around
like,
her.
Well, what's also weird about that too is that she also gets a sexually transmitted disease in this movie.
I thought about that actually when I was watching and forgot to say anything about it.
But yeah, also, and she's like a lot more of a normal,
she's
more
a little bit reserved and like, it's
but,
kind of in a good way. I think like this blank slate who kind of wants to be a part of this world but isn't sure exactly how to interact with it.
Yeah,
and she's not quite as confident as Kate Beckinsale's Charlotte is.
Yeah, she's a lot more. I mean, it says here, a rather narcissistic and shallow person.
I really, you heard the quote earlier in the trailer. I think it's actually part of the satire of what Stillman's getting at with this movie, where she's dancing and she says, all those like those people, those 60s like teens or 20-somethings who that Woodstock generation, they didn't really know how to dance. Like, we're an improved version of them, and I feel like he's very clearly almost pointing at the screen and saying, look how conceited and narcissistic she is to even think something like that. I think she's really great though in the movie. She plays a very unlikable character.
Yeah,
but she gives one of her best performances. I'd definitely say.
Yeah, but I mean, shove off, Mac.
Yeah. But she's somebody that I'm mostly annoyed when she's on screen, but I never wanted her to leave. You know what I mean? It's like I'm annoyed by her, but I kind of want her to still be around and be that presence, So I think she's terrific in the movie. I think she's secretly one of the best performances in the movie.
And we've talked about Eggman already, but
he's always great to see.
Yeah, we'll jump down to Matt Kiesler real quickly. As Josh Neff, he's the assistant district attorney who takes an interest in Alice. Basically, he's mainly actually sending people in there. They're trying to get this whole case and evidence and a case against the guy who owns the club. Who is, I'm trying to remember what that guy's name is in this. Bernie is the guy's name. Yeah, David Thornton is Bernie.
Oh,
that's the owner.
Yeah.
And basically, but then it talks a lot about he had this like nervous breakdown or something. But anyway, and he has he's a manic depressive or something.
Yeah, he's he's kind of got this mysterious presence in the movie. He kind of comes and goes and is, again, he has this kind of past that is hinted at and talked about as far as his college days. And I don't know, his character is actually one of the things that I don't know is exactly a flaw in the movie, but a kind of a curious element that doesn't exactly find a place. I think that
what works for him and Savigny being together is they both don't really fit into everything, and so they being together by the end makes sense. But his character is very kind of weird and hard to, because he's like, well,
I think that might maybe that adds
I love disco.
Yeah, he's got this very weird sound of his voice.
Disco was not people just dancing; it was a movement. It will never die. It's just very.
So I think you're right though about that. Him and Alice, his characters, don't exactly fit. So it makes sense that they would kind of fit together. And the very final moments of them kind of dancing together on this train while Love Train literally plays. Let me just say also, this is one of my favorite soundtracks of any movie ever. I mean, now there's probably some I like disco.
Yeah.
A good amount. There are probably hardcore disco heads who are like, obvious. But this movie is wall to wall banger after banger hit of song of this era and this moment. You know what I mean? So much so that I wonder how much of the budget was just securing
That's
those
what I was
songs.
going to say. Yeah, it's probably a lot.
I love this soundtrack.
Yeah. Mackenzie Aston is Jimmy Steinway, an ambitious friend of Dez who works in club advertising. Yeah, he's the guy that works in advertising.
He's one of the more likable people, I think, in the movie. And he kind of feels like he's being stiffed as this square who's not allowed to be in this world because of his advertising
being
connections.
used by the guy, what's his name? The guy that plays Bull on those TV shows that got in trouble for sexual harassment or something. What's his name? That guy's on all the NCIS shows and everything.
Is his name on here?
He's not on here. On the list.
I'm going to look that guy's name
It'll
up
probably
here.
take 3 hours because of the Wi-Fi. But anyway, yeah, that he is basically acts like he's an advertising guy.
Michael Weatherly.
Yeah, Michael Weatherly. That he acts like he's an advertising client, so he can bring in basically undercover cops and to get evidence against the Bernie guy, and that they're literally using the Mackenzie Aston character Jimmy Steinway.
Yeah.
Don't you notice how often they don't call him by his first name? They call him Jimmy Steinway throughout the movie a lot. Like, oh, he's Jimmy Steinway.
Yeah.
But like not in like a cool way, like, oh, that's Jimmy Steinway over there.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he's used basically the whole movie as that. So he's really good. He's funny. Robert Sean Leonard is Tom Platt. He's one of the things in the movie I'm also kind of a question mark about.
I feel like early on it's led on that he's going to be Alice's love interest, and then that kind of falls by the wayside.
Right.
Robert Sean Leonard, it should be said, is another big actor of this certain generation. He was most famously in Dead Poets Society was his biggest thing that
was
he
on
was
House.
known for.
Dr. James Wilson on House. God, what a name.
Yeah.
So white. He's like, the guy that gives her gonorrhea and herpes, so yeah, cool on him, I guess. No, not really. Jennifer Beals is Nina Moritz. Yeah, is this woman that Dez is with at different times, and he's the one he like comes out to. She's the one he comes out to, and then that's the whole thing. Matthew Ross, we talked about last week a lot. He's that disco sucks guy. The Harvard graduate and co-worker of Alice and Charlotte says, they call him Departmental Dan all the time. And he's like this guy who doesn't like them, but then becomes part of the group.
I was gonna say
like,
something about this when I was saying earlier is I think what makes this such an interesting generational statement of a certain generation of young adult that was coming into their own around this time, and this is true of a lot of generations of adults when you look at people your own age. Sometimes you don't even like people, but you find yourself at the same parties or interactions with them, and you kind of are like, well, I don't really like you, but oh well, we're going to kind of be friends just because we're just want to be a part of this same scene. And if somebody who was kind of downgrading disco earlier, he pops up in these clubs various times and is like, okay, well, I'll just hang out.
Kind
and
of
be
a
part
version of that is what happens, I can tell, with students in classes where they're with a lot of the same people and they might not like them, but there does eventually become a certain
kinship
because they're just there with each other all the time. So it's like,
and I think a lot of people think that ends when one graduates high school or college, but it persists in social circles through one's various times of life. So he's an interesting representation of that.
Tara Subkoff is Holly. That's that friend of Charlotte and Alice that he's with. There's not a whole lot to say about her in the movie. She's just kind of in and out here and there.
Matt Ross' character like he's the one that's dating her?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Burr Steers is Van, a worker at the disco and sort of henchman of Bernie's. He's this real like New York guy. I know at one point he's talking about going to Ibiza or whatever, and that's the whole thing. Funny thing about him in the movie, there's that one part because he's constantly on Dez's case, don't really like him, wanting him fired all the time. There's that part though at the end when Matt Kiesler's giving his whole like what is disco monologue, and there's that shot of Burr Steers like with sunglasses kind of moving closer to the action, that like B-roll moment of him like I am listening, like it's so just like oh my god. But it's funny. David Thornton we talked about is Bernie. What a random guy. He wrote his paper, his senior paper on Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
So Mark McKinney, I don't remember him in it. So, supposedly George Plimpton and Anthony Hayden Guest are in this movie as club goers, but I don't really remember that. I'm surprised I didn't see George Plimpton in there somewhere.
Wasn't he just mentioned in a episode we were watching of Only Murders in the Building, where he was mentioned by Martin Short's character, I think.
And then there's some characters that show up from the other movies. It doesn't matter to bring that up, really. But as far as, we kind of talked about this a little bit already, but New York nostalgia.
Well, I know we were watching this movie, and you made a comment, which I think is something we can kind of use as a jumping off point, that every version of New York has now been romanticized.
Yeah.
What do you think about this 90s version of early 80s New York being romanticized? What do you think that means or says?
Well, it's important to note, too, this was, in the beginnings of, especially, but just before the kind of Wall Street, New York craze of, the movie Wall Street, and kind of the popularization of Wall Street as a cultural thing, and that this is kind of just before that. Also, it's weird because it's kind of in that weird period where it's at the end of the 70s, but it's also, all right, we're trying to build up New York to look a little better by that time.
After the 70s was very famously one of, some people hate that era of New York, other people have romanticized it. If you've seen the movie Taxi Driver, that's basically what New York was in the 70s.
Right, or Summer of Sam, or the first two seasons of The Deuce, mostly, and then that third season is a lot more about the 80s.
But the kind of dirty, grimy subculture that something like disco thrived in, and that was kind of wild and a genuine cultural phenomenon that then kind of like everything else became kind of, basically just, frozen in time and wasn't innovating, and that kind of, I feel like, is what this is about as well. Once the white yuppies got into it, then it started to fade as a phenomenon.
Right. Yeah, and so that it's kind of what this movie's about in a lot of ways, is then also people moving on from that and New York becoming a lot more commodified into the 80s. So it's a weird kind of stepping stone between the 70s and the 80s, is that very brief time period of where these people were into disco, and then it kind of disappeared after that. And it hasn't ever really made a comeback. It's funny because he's like, it'll never die. And it's like, well,
that's one of the most obvious moments of the movie.
Yeah.
And I don't really hate that scene exactly, but it is one of those scenes that just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, because I feel like most of the movie, while being satirical, also is being subtle, and I feel like that's one of the times that it kind of...
Yeah. And I think club culture in America has continued to musically to be similar to disco in certain ways, but also... that's always been way more of a, electronica in Europe and kind of, European disco and what's it called, that, I'm trying to think of the Euro dance, or like
EDM too.
And like all that is still way bigger there than it is in America, in general. So because just general pop music, hip hop, and rock music have always been bigger.
Hip hop has taken over that space, as opposed to what, again, EDM is big here, but bigger in Europe, as well as that kind of that Euro pop music. But I mean, it still has some fashion here, but not quite as big.
So therefore, it never really has totally come back, which is interesting. That this makes this movie even more interesting, because it's like, oh, remember
to that
disco,
point, do you think? To what extent do you think Stillman is being ironic versus reverential towards disco as a phenomenon? I feel like it's mostly reverential, while also poking fun at people who take it seriously and want to intellectualize it.
Yeah, because I think it is also saying, oh, disco was nice, but it's also a way of saying, well, it also was just nice as a way for people to meet and do something. It wasn't exactly...
And this is being used as the venue to let that happen.
It wasn't exactly the thing itself as it was the memory of what the thing facilitated more than the actual thing. Right. Even though at the end it does feel like it's like, no, disco is important. And it's like... Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm not even disagreeing with that fact. It's just, but it's, yeah, that's one of those things that it's, I think that's more what it was about than the actual thing.
And again, going back to that Woodstock comment too, that, you know, the generation of Woodstock would have said the exact same thing about like the rock and roll teens of the 50s, you know what I mean? And that they're saying this about this now, and that there's going to be literally the generation watching this movie or rolling their eyes at Kate Beckinsale say that about disco, you know what I mean? I think there's this kind of circularity of when I'm in my 20s and what is hip to me, that's ultimate hipness, and in its own way that's fallacy, or that's a folly to categorize that, because those tastes are always changing in that way.
Right.
This movie to me also, I mentioned it last week earlier, is its own kind of Gen X document, because so much of the big Gen X filmmakers of this time period, Quentin Tarantino is probably the biggest one to think of, but Paul Thomas Anderson, mentioned him earlier, Noah Baumbach, you know, even Alexander Payne, various, you know, filmmakers of this time period that are younger starting to make movies. I think Whit Stillman actually might be a little older than them, but he still was coming of age cinematically in this time. This interest in dialogue-driven stories, which this is a very dialogue-driven movie, and also over-intellectualization of the things they grew up with, whether it be Bambi, whether it be Lady and the Tramp, Scrooge McDuck. Like, I mean, there's all these like kind of cultural references, and I'm like, oh, you know that thing we grew up with? What do we think about it now that we're adults? And kind of like making it, quote, hip or fad, or commenting on the unhipness or unfadness of them.
Right.
This movie is very much in conversation with that, you know. I mean, very famously, Reservoir Dogs kicks off with all these ways that Like a Virgin actually, as lyrics, has this deep meaning, and, you know, and I think Tarantino is a big one to think about with this, because his movies are littered with pop culture references. But again, these other filmmakers of this time period, again, he's a little older, but nonetheless kind of making movies in this Gen X time period. Whit Stillman shows an interest in kind of making the characters in these dialogue-driven movies articulate these signposts culturally of the past to make themselves act like they understood it or, quote, got it in a way that maybe other people do not necessarily do that. But did you have any thoughts about that, kind of as again, as the dialogue-driven movies go, in particular the dialogue of this movie? Or how it drives the story, or how it drives the characters.
Yeah, the like you said, in the 90s, that was so much of more of an idea of this dialogue has to do this. Because you think back even with, like, because I've been reading that book about Chinatown, the making of Chinatown, and Robert Towne writing about it. And dialogue is a big part of those screenplays, but it's also just the conception of the story and the structure of the story and the way information is told, whereas that kind of screenwriting, which is just very different, is very different, like I said, from this, of kind of the wordiness and the more naturalistic dialogue, or even heightened versions of naturalistic dialogue. That it's just a different kind of screenwriting. And that, like I said, that kind of explosion of that in the 90s was just such a big part of the decade, where it basically independent cinema since then has thrived off of, more or less.
Yeah, and it's obviously dialogue that drives character more so than plot, and a movie like this is not really all that much plot-oriented. It feels like you're just going to be hanging out in these clubs with these characters for a prolonged period of time, and that ultimately, there is a plot about something shady's going on in the club, or there is a plot about Alice, maybe he's going to get this promotion or go in this other line of work, or are they going to get an apartment or whatever. But on the whole, it's mostly just all these scenes, and I say this as a positive or a compliment, these scenes are excuses to hang out with these people, as opposed to something's got to happen by the end of Act 2 and then it's got to be paid off in Act 3. It's not that kind of movie. And I think that obviously these Gen X era filmmakers, most of those movies reflect that interest. while at the same time, interestingly, a movie like Pulp Fiction, while it's very much driven by dialogue, actually its orientation of plot was part of the novelty of that movie at the same time.
Right.
So it just depends on the movie and the filmmaker. But or you even think about, like, spoiler alert, how William H. Macy's suicide in Boogie Nights, how that immediately has this tonal impact on the rest of the plot and the characters of the movie. And that's like, there's almost before and after a moment like that. So, and that way, I just think The Last Days of Disco is a very prime example of not only depicting this culture, but also depicting the values of a certain generation of filmmaker, that this is obviously part of that lineage in that way.
Right.
Any other thoughts on Last Days of Disco?
No, I think it's a really good movie. I don't think it's a perfect movie as far as certain things that about it.
And don't worry, we're getting ready to talk about a much more imperfect movie.
but I mean, that's the only reason why it's not 5 stars, I think, rather than 4.5. They're just minor things that are kind of like, okay, like, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, I think it's really big accomplishment for the independent movie.
And I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to pick it, is because not only does it depict its time and place in terms of this late 70s, early 80s New York, but I feel like it is in its own way a great depiction of time and place in terms of what American cinema's values were during this time period.
Right.
So,
what about American cinema's values during with American History X?
Well, we're going to get into that. Here's the trailer for American History X.
American History X.
Look, I told you, I don't want you all coming up here to see me.
I don't care what you tell me, okay?
I'm trying to get through this, and you're just making it harder.
You think you're the only one doing time, Derek? You think I'm not in here with you?
He was his mother's hope.
He's gone. You don't know the world your children are living in.
His father's legacy.
It's everywhere I look now. What? This affirmative black shit.
The white man marches on!
See this? That means not welcome.
And his brother's hero.
I trust you, Derek.
Drop your weapon! Get now!
All that anger, all that hate.
Has anything you've done made your life better?
Derek Vineyard was released from Chino early this morning.
Hey, man, how you doing?
Too big to give me a hug?
Oh, it's good to see you. Check this out, man.
When'd you get that?
What?
Well, I came to talk about Danny. He's headed right where you are.
What's wrong with you?
Let the kid alone. He thinks the joint messed with your mind.
Did.
I'm asking you to do whatever's in your power.
You know what you can do? You can get me shot by a bunch of white boys. I am out, and Danny is out too. And if you come near my family again, I will feed you your heart.
What's happening, Dad? I don't think you realize what's been going on here. We are 10 times what we were.
They're after you, man. They're gonna come for me. They're gonna come for me. There ain't nothing I can do. Hey, Danny!
Shoot it!
I love you, and you're my best friend. And I'm not telling you what to do, but I need you to understand.
Already kicked us off with that New Line logo.
Yeah,
at the front.
and you know the
I think the '90s cinema when I see that New Line.
Yeah,
logo.
but just that opening though of like they were wronged, like, you know, kind of like what did they do with it, like, and then like Trump almost, you know. But yeah, this movie, wow. Overall, a good movie. I'm going to get it out there before
I'll
we get
say
into it.
We didn't really. We knew that more so than kids, and I think we're going to mention some other things about kids here and there, and we talk about this. Kids as a thing, as a phenomenon to me, has kind of haunted these movies since then in terms of its place in American movies and just that good and bad. Well, mostly bad. Just legacies of that movie, but I do say, like Levi said, I do like this movie. It is imperfect, but I think what its intentions are mostly good and honorable in terms of that. But we'll get into that here in a second. American History X is a 1998 American crime drama film directed by Tony Kaye in his feature directorial debut. That's shocking. Yeah. And written by David McKenna. Stars Edward Norton and Edward Furlong as two brothers from Los Angeles who are involved in the white power, skinhead, and neo-Nazi movements. The older brother, Norton, serves 3 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter, is rehabilitated during this time, and then tries to prevent his brother, Furlong, from being indoctrinated further. Supporting cast includes, go through this quickly, Fairuza Balk, Stacy Keach, Elliot Gould, very shockingly.
Yeah.
We were not aware he was in this, so that was
I have some things I want to say about his character later in the movie that's not about the character so much as it is about the realism of the movie, but anyway, we'll talk about
Avery
that.
Brooks, Ethan Suplee, and Beverly D'Angelo.
Mm-hmm.
We'll briefly touch on, we talked about this a little bit last week, but I was reading some more details about the whole production of this movie was very fraught. Again, it was Tony Kaye's first movie, which is, again, as I said, shocking. Before its release, though, he and the film studio were in disagreements about the final cut of the film, which Norton had played a pivotal role in conceiving. Final version was longer than Kaye intended, which is a very strange phenomenon, which resulted in him publicly disowning the film, thus negatively affecting his directing career. Because this movie was generally well regarded critically.
Yeah.
And was nominated for various Oscars. I know most especially Edward Norton was nominated for Best Actor.
Yeah.
Which I think was deserved.
Mm-hmm.
And so this movie had a very strange production. For one thing, I was shocked by it says Joaquin Phoenix was offered the role of Derek Vineyard, but he was not interested. Imagine this movie with Joaquin Phoenix. That would have been...
Imagine Stacey Keach saying, "You're a blinking dead man, Vineyard," to him.
Yeah.
You know? Don't make me wait! Kind of attitude.
So, yeah, Kaye actually wanted a shorter cut of the... Usually you always hear about these situations. They want a longer cut.
Right.
And it went the other way, which is shocking. In part because actually some of this... And I thought this was actually interesting to read into why he wanted it cut. That he thought some of the stuff actually humanized Norton and his family a little more, and he thought that it actually, like, lightened the punch a little bit of what the movie was trying to say, and that he was... But they shot the stuff.
Yeah.
Then I guess he regretted it, or, you know, a movie like this is very fraught anyways, and so you probably try a lot of things that sometimes get left on the cutting room floor, and I think his vision of it was a little harsher than what it even tries to do in humanizing Vineyard's character, and that he was like, no, we need to cut this stuff, and that, again, that actually Norton and the studio were like, no, let's keep it in, and then he basically disowned the movie, which there's a funny little detail I read about. Yeah, he wanted to apply for various pseudonyms, including Humpty Dumpty. He wanted to be quoted. Imagine the end of this movie.
And it's like directed by Humpty. Well, it doesn't even actually say directed by. It's just
that's
the names.
True. It doesn't.
So I noticed that.
But they said the DGA said no to that. They refused. He then filed a $200 million lawsuit against DGA and New Line Cinema, but it was dismissed in 2000. He disowned the movie. It was 24 minutes longer than his own cut. He said it was, quote, total abuse of creativity and crammed with shots of everyone crying in each other's arms.
Yeah.
I also read later that he did not see the film until June 2007. So he waited. I guess. I mean, you gotta imagine that had to be a very, whether you agree with what he did or not, very traumatic experience that you kind of want to distance yourself from.
Yeah, I get it. But, wow.
He later admitted that, quote, my ego got in the way. That was entirely my fault. Whenever I can, I take the opportunity to apologize. And he didn't direct another movie until 2006's Lake of Fire, which is, I think, a documentary about abortion and abortion
man, he's
issues.
just having a great time then, sounds
Another
like.
thing, too, and I promise we're going to get to this movie in a second, but I thought this was interesting. It says his third film was a crime drama titled Blackwater Transit, Stars Lawrence Fishburne, Carl Urban, Evan Ross, Brittany Snow, and Stephen Dorff. It was shot in New Orleans during the summer of '07. A rough cut was screened at the 2009 Cannes Film Festival, but the film was never released to cinemas. As of 2017, so we don't have an update on that. Film is unfinished due to the production company's bankruptcy and the ensuing litigation.
What?
So this movie's basically not even...
Right. Or no, does it say litigate? Oh, I was thinking of like liquidated.
I think it basically means the suing.
Yeah, right. They can't. Right. Yeah.
But, so, this guy...
if you look at a picture of him, he looks like he's been through a lot. So it's like,
Now, his fourth film, Detachment, starred Adrian Brody, who himself is a veteran of behind-the-scenes drama, looking back to like Thin Red Line. Also, The Pianist with Roman Polanski. There's a drama about teachers. So imagine him taking on education realm. Centers on Brody as a struggling substitute teacher in a failing New York public school. I can in my head just see that whole movie.
Yeah.
And it might be good, but I can just kind of see that already play out. It played at various film festivals.
Yeah. Shia LaBeouf. That movie there.
Yeah, Stranger Than the Wheel.
Yeah.
Was something he was set to direct in early 2016. I don't know if anything's happened with that, though, so it probably didn't happen. Neither project come to fruition. So, also, American History Y, starring Digimon Hunsu, is something that he's trying to maybe work on
based
doing.
on conversations he had with Marlon Brando. What?
So, don't you know that he's...
that pick, I'm just
So, what do you make out of all of this stuff with him, and does any of that chaotic nature reflected to you in this movie?
Yeah, and I'll say why. I think that the beginning of this movie, and the whole movie's this way, but especially the beginning, I felt like I could adjust to it more as it went, is one of the most overdramatic films I've ever seen. It's like up there with... that still manages to be good.
Yeah.
Like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a movie that I think is barely good, in my opinion.
Quite like that, but I get it, yeah.
It's funny because you used to be kind of about it, and I loved it, and now it's like we've switched.
Yeah.
But, but this movie starts, and it's literally like, oh my God, are you serious?
And does it ever end?
Yes. Well, in his opinion, it didn't, I guess, because it was too long. But
it would have been hilarious if they went with directed by Humpty Dumpty. I'm just thinking about how confusing that would have been for so many people.
Yeah,
seeing that on the poster.
Yeah,
people have been staring at it like Humpty Dumpty.
Sounds like McGee or something, but not as dumb somehow. Like it would honestly be dumber if the movie said directed by McGee than Humpty Dumpty. But anyway, with this movie starts, though, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this is really happening. Like, I'm really watching this level of stupidity going on. As far as just the over-dramatic, By the way, I want to say before we get any further, Elliot Gould in the movie, how is he that kid's teacher? Based on everything that's happened.
Yeah.
He literally was at their house when they had this massive family blow-up.
He's having, like, a relationship, basically, it's hinting with the mother, played by Beverly D'Angelo. Right. And so, and then, he's part of that whole confrontation leaves,
it's like,
and then is later...
How would that not be like, he will never be anywhere near you?
Yeah, right.
Like,
yeah.
And also,
you would go to a guidance counselor and say, not this kid.
Yeah.
Put him somewhere else.
Right. Or even the fact that he's literally writing about Mein Kampf and he's Jewish and it's clearly intent. There's a lot of things there that are like, no, we're not doing that.
So you think that's pretty unrealistic?
Yeah.
You think?
At least now. I don't know about in the 90s. Maybe people just didn't give a crap. I don't know. But that's just no. But all that's to say, the movie's like that, and then Edward Norton's in the movie. And then the movie really becomes something, I think, because I've never been the biggest Edward Norton fan.
I was getting ready to bring this up,
but I think this is his best performance, probably bar none. And I know there's parts of it that are a little over the top. And one of the actually worst things in the movie is the scene, and this is yet another example of why would they be watching this, like, where they're watching that news footage of him going off after his dad got killed his dad was a firefighter,
Yeah.
and he got shot by these, I think, African American.
And this goes to the
something.
self-seriousness of the movie to the point where it actually starts to get a little funny,
right?
Which is a weird way to go, but movies go this way more often than not when you do something this serious. Is it shows him as a teenager, and it's clearly Edward Norton
in like a backwards hat, and
it's like playing a teenager moment, is kind of funny. Anyways,
and that like he's just starts cussing and going off on all these epithets and all that, and that just feels very like, oh my! I literally remember just kind of having my face in my hand, just like I can't believe I'm watching this right now. But then, like I said, he finally comes into the movie and he grounds the movie immediately in both his crazy era, which is all in black and white. There's that parts of the movie that are in black and white, which are him
kind of prior to and during his time in prison,
right? And then there's the stuff in color where he's reformed and he's back out of jail. And essentially that both of these go together in a great way. I think in the end that give a full portrait of a person that is definitely the most interesting person in the movie, obviously, and the one who the movie's really kind of about in its own way, even though Edward Furlong is sort of the main character in a way, because it's all from his point of view. What gets real confusing is when he's writing the paper, and that's where we should say about the whole movie. The conceit of the movie is that he just got out of jail. The whole movie happens over basically a 24-hour period.
Loosely.
And there's a lot of flashbacks in it, though. And Edward Norton just got out of prison after 3 years. And that his brother, Edward Furlong, is having to write this paper for the principal, basically. Or is he he's the principal, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, he used to be a teacher,
right, but I think he's the principal now. And so a guy that he actually also that Vineyard knew in jail, and or when he was there as a student, and then he came to him in jail. He was a former teacher of him,
and then he comes to try to help him rehabilitate himself while he's in jail.
But so that he's having to write this paper reflecting about. He says, "I want you to write about your brother." Basically, because he already knows, and they've kind of been in conversation that they're going to try to, save him from that path, more or less, from being a white supremacist and neo-Nazi. And the whole rest of the movie is kind of telling Vineyard's story, but also Edward Furlong's recollections of that. But then in the middle of the movie, or more towards the end, it does the whole prison section of the movie, which is him narrating it to Edward Furlong, who then narrates that into the paper. So that gets kind of confusing about what exactly is going on there. But yeah, so that's ultimately all to say that Edward Norton has, both named Edward randomly, I just realized, that he has definitely a character that is more worth its salt than even something like Fight Club the next year.
Yeah.
Which is
another portrait of white male rage.
Right. And that his whole journey throughout this movie is very interesting, that he started as this relatively unassuming kid. There's no real reason he didn't really
who
have
has
any
above average intelligence,
racist ideas or anything, and that and we'll talk about that in a little bit, about what I think is actually pretty genius about that scene of him and the only seeing his father's in the movie in a flashback, and going from just being relatively normal, and just the anger of his father being dead, and him attaching and going into all those racist ideas based on what happened, and then going to jail and getting out of that, and then even by the end, and there'll be a lot of spoilers about this, the Edward Furlong's death at the end of the movie kind of leaves it as a big question of like, well, how's he going to feel now, and I don't necessarily think he would go back into those ideas. I feel like he's far too reformed by the ending for that, but that is an interesting question that thankfully has no answer exactly. I think by the end is to say, well, we don't really know what's going to happen to him now.
I think one of the best things about this movie, and a movie that I liked a decent amount, was its portrait of causality, how one does not just simply become someone who hates other people.
Right.
That it's based on a series of things. Life experiences and personal grievances that make up for one's own, frankly, class struggles in life, which is ultimately what this is a portrait of. And I love that the movie withheld that scene between him and his father till like literally basically the end of the movie.
And that's even Edward Furlong reflecting on that too, about him thinking about, my father was actually the one who set us on this path kind of inadvertently.
Because I think early on we're like, okay, doesn't it imply that he was killed during the Watts riot, but it doesn't exactly say it? I think
basically, he was trying to put out a fire, and he was killed.
Because in the Wikipedia page, the plot summary, it says, years earlier, Danny and Derek's father, a firefighter, were shot and killed while trying to put out a fire. So it implies, and then Watts is mentioned a time or two in the movie. So I thought the implication was
I didn't think about that specifically, but
and the legacy that left in these few years in Los Angeles, which was a very chaotic period in the city's history due to Rodney King beating and when I'm talking about Watts, that's the '60s anyway.
Yeah, you're talking about
I
Rodney
meant
King,
that's what I meant. Excuse me, because Watts was in '65, but anyway, because Watts
the Rodney King
beating and all that stuff that happened in the early '90s, and then there's the OJ trial also that happened in the '90s in Los Angeles, of course. But I love that it withheld that scene for so long because that was almost the missing ingredient to totally understanding how this evolution happens. I also loved how long it took him to reform himself in prison. Yeah. That also was not something that happened just overnight. That it was this, and this is why hate, when held up towards the light of friendship and understanding and empathizing with somebody, eliminates such things. Probably my favorite scenes were the scenes between him and his friend, the black friend that was in the prison. I don't remember that character's name. Guy Torrey is Lamont. That those scenes where at first Lamont's kind of joking with him, and he's just not saying anything. He's I'm not even gonna talk to you, and that his kind of persistence of listen, man, we're gonna be stuck here no matter what, and so we might as well get to liking each other. And then they start talking about basketball and they talk about how they got there, and I think that was another breakthrough moment for him when he talks about what did you do to get here, and he's like, I was trying to steal a TV. And I dropped the TV on the cop's foot by accident by bumping into him.
He got 6 years, I think.
And he realized, I killed somebody and got 3 years. And, this guy, because he was black, I mean, and it's not said, but it's very clearly that's what's happening, what's being said. And this guy, for being black and he's trying to steal something, but obviously he got a harsher sentence because of dropping this on a cop and, frankly, just being black. And so that is part of his thing of, wait a minute. And then that very touching moment, and probably my favorite moment of the movie, where he's leaving kind of the prison, and he sees him, and he's like, I got the feeling that you were looking out for me. And that Lamont, not breaking character, or, quote, to use a wrestling term, kayfabe, and to say, nah, man, whatever, you get out of here, and acting like he didn't actually care about him, but he very clearly did. Was a very touching moment of how hate can disappear and hate can be reformed as a concept. I love too.
Yeah, and also another thing that goes along with that too, I think, that's running counter to that is the whole Aryan Brotherhood people in the movie that are in the prison, kind of showing that they don't really even believe exactly in the things they talk about, because then they're dealing drugs with some of the Latino gangs, and he's like, well, what are you even doing? You're not even following that. And it's at first he's mad because he's having these racist thoughts, but then after a while he's like, well, they're just not even, what's even the point? If we're not going to hold up to these ideas, why am I even doing it? And then they obviously rape him in prison because he was gonna in the shower,
not being
because basically he wasn't going to follow along with what they wanted to do, and that's ultimately him realizing, well, these people are supposed to look out for me, and they're not, and then this other guy who's black,
no reason to like
and who has
him.
no reason to like me, actually is looking out for me, and that's kind of the turning point. It worked. Both of those ideas working together.
I think that's coupled with the fact of what's the teacher's name that also helps reform him again? That actor Avery Brooks.
Mm-hmm.
What's the teacher name again? Dr. Bob Sweeney. That realization that this guy actually got through to me when I was young, clearly cared about me, and is still caring about me even when I've done all these things.
Yeah.
To not only help save my own soul, but my brother's soul. And so he's realizing, wait a minute, these people of color actually care way more about me than these other people, these other white people act like they do.
Yeah.
And so, I think in that way, this movie is a very deeply empathetic movie and trying to understand and break down these ideas. Another way I really think this movie is brilliant is you heard this line in the trailer of Beverly D'Angelo when she's visiting him in jail, says something along the lines of, "You think you're the only one locked up? That this whole experience has locked all of us up, literally." And did it really say what she was sick with through most of the movie? She clearly had some kind of, I don't know if it was cancer,
probably lung cancer
or
or something, because she was a smoker. I don't know.
She clearly had some medical thing going on, and then there's also the sister that is kind of this figure who pops in and out of the movie, who's very clearly kind of more enlightened and intelligent, and kind of objects to this whole phenomenon that her brothers have given way to. Which in its own way is a portrait of masculinity, I feel like, too, because the movie's very clearly saying these are how women respond to these things, and these are how men respond to these things. And the men have this very much more intensely hateful, way in which they try to exercise their grief over the loss of their father. And also that they're remembering some of their father's last words of hate that then springboard into them being an even greater version of hatred. Also, let me just say, it was slightly traumatic of somebody in my generation who grew up with Boy Meets World, hearing the father of that show express such hateful ideas and remarks. It was like, oh, wow, you really thought that, huh?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, too, about that scene, I kind of meant to say this a while ago when we were talking about it. What's interesting about that scene, too, is he starts with this kind of coded, like, yeah, well, you know.
And then it goes on, and it keeps
finally, he's just like, no, and uses the N-word or something, and kind of is like saying, this is how I really feel. And he's just looking up to his dad, so he's like, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever. And then once he is killed that kind of, I said, is that kind of has stuck in his brain of saying, well, I need to believe that because my father believed it, and the circumstances of this are leading me to believe this. So yeah, and so that all those whole, I felt like the last half of the movie was better than the first, because the opening of it I felt was just a little too on the nose and too obvious. And I mean, literally, we will call this class
American History X.
I love he waits for a second. American History X. Like, wow.
A movie that, and this gets into kind of maybe the broader spectrum of these movies of this time period. One movie that I thought a lot about, and we talked about this last year after we had first seen it, was Menace to Society.
Yeah. Which
is also a very 90s Los Angeles portrait. That's, of course, much more from a black perspective.
Yeah.
But the idea and the hauntingness imagery specifically of the movie ending with the dying words of the two main characters, effectively, like you said, Edward Furlong and this.
And somehow this ending was more peaceful than that.
Yeah, it was. Weird. I mean, I think the Menace to Society is a pretty disturbing portrait in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, also that, just to get into the specifics of that movie is coming from, I don't know where the narration of that movie's coming from hell, essentially, because it's like, because
you don't really even realize that till the end when you look
back
on the whole thing.
But with this, it's like the words were written, so even though he's dead, it's something that was written down that we're hearing. So there's almost there's a peacefulness. It's like the book has been closed and he's dead, but there's like, it's like there's a strange peacefulness to that.
Yeah.
Whereas from that, it's like, no, this person's literally speaking from beyond the grave, from hell, like, you know, which is like I said, a different feeling.
But I wanted to bring that movie up, too, because it's very similar, but that, to me, is a superior movie for a variety of reasons, one of which, its tone is something the movie is able to maintain in a very specific, strict way throughout. And part of what we were saying earlier is this movie sometimes feels so reverential to the point of being a parody almost. And you feel the Oscar moment of, this is the scene, and again, I have no fault in Edward Norton. I think he's great in the movie, but like the scene construction and the tone itself, this is the scene where the white supremacist son yells at the family. And I think it is a mostly good scene, but you do feel the conventional Hollywood nature a few times of that. I mean, Menace to Society does not feel the least bit conventional in a Hollywood way. I mean, and that's part of why it's great, I think, is that it has a tone that feels all its own, and this is a version of, while trying to do something similar in a more white context, it also is, sometimes it takes itself so seriously to the point it kind of breaks. And there's even the moment that we laughed at, and there's even a gif of, and I might even use a moment of that as one of the banner photos for this episode, of when he's getting arrested, Edward Norton, he's got his hands behind his head, and he's got this little look that is almost like, again, I feel weird because I love Edward Norton's performance in the movie, but it's almost like, look what I've done, which is like, almost makes you want to laugh, and it's nothing that's happened is funny, and I think that speaks
the implication, I think, of that is that he's basically telling his brother, because I think it was 2 black men that killed their father, saying, look at, I got my revenge, and, which he only actually killed one person, the other one got away.
Which in the end was what it was all about for him anyways. Because obviously the ideology of white supremacy is revealed to be a fallacy, as it is in this movie, and that really, for men like this that are mad, they want revenge, they want to take lives, because that is the only equation they can have of this loss, of this grief that they have of losing people.
We haven't talked at all, obviously, about Stacy Keach yet in the movie, who we've talked a lot about with The Scene. We've talked about The Scene a million times.
Yeah, he plays Cameron Alexander, one of the strangest names for a man of that age and specific generation.
What do you think about him in the movie in general?
Well,
I mean, he's only in actually a couple scenes. He's not actually in
that was something that we knew, the scene we played last week, and very famously the scene of them fighting and him getting basically knocked down and out
at the Dead Man Vineyard.
And him saying all that. And we thought that there were going to be these big implications of they were going to come back to haunt him or kill him. That actually doesn't happen.
Because they got assaulted somehow after that. I don't really, and it doesn't say what.
At first, I thought when they come to talk to them at the diner, I thought they were going to say, they're out looking for you to get you. But actually, it turned out to not be that. I was a little surprised by that.
But then it's implying they got into a scuffle with somebody else. It's like, what?
And then there's also his woo moment of the basketball game, which we can talk about.
I'll probably put that up on the on Instagram.
But that whole moment of we won the basketball court. It was like a white
and the music is so big
court.
too. And what's kind of funny about that too is it's like there were white guys that were friends of the black guys that were there, and they're like, "Yeah, we'll be on your team." It's just kind of what's that say about y'all? I don't know, but this is weird. But
I mean, he seemed like he's quote the villain. But another thing I do like about this movie is they're not really traditional heroes and villains. I mean, most of the movie, Edward Norton feels like he's the villain, but then obviously it's about his transformation, but he kind of pops up as this villain or this influence, but then he kind of falls by the wayside.
And he clearly is a villain.
Oh, right.
But, no, I know what you mean, though, where it's like, but he's not the prevailing antagonist of the movie.
Yeah. It almost feels like the antagonist of the movie, not to be too cute, is circumstance. It's more like forces outside of these people's control that prompt them to make conscious decisions to give way to hate. And as you said, one of the haunting questions for me, we didn't really talk about this, you mentioned it earlier, is the question of what's next.
Yeah.
Like he's gone through this big transformation, and then his brother is killed by a black classmate of his, who himself is part of a gang that is himself.
There's a scene at the beginning of the movie of them kind of fighting with each other. Well, he actually saves this white kid from getting beaten up by them.
There's the older brother in Malcolm in the Middle who was in my best friend's wedding last week.
And so, anyway, and it's this whole thing of they have this vendetta against him, so that all happens as a result of his actions. And that's kind of what that whole final scene, and both with the older Vineyard and the younger Vineyard, just by the way, Vineyard.
Yeah. Every time I hear that name, I think of the novel Vineland or Vinland. Vinland, but it's Vineyard, but anyways.
But anyway, and that basically that whole moment is literally like basically the consequence or result of things that have happened they've already repented in their hearts for. That it's like, no, it's going to happen anyway. This is your punishment for doing that. And it's like, and obviously that's a very kind of, I know Tony Kaye is Jewish, and that's a big part of this movie as well, as obviously the anti-Semitism of the movie and kind of thinking about that. But that seems like a very Old Testament kind of idea of, okay, well, that still, and I know he wasn't the screenwriter of this movie, somebody else wrote it, but that feels like a very Old Testament idea of like, oh, well, you still, it doesn't matter. Like, maybe
somebody has to pay.
And it's even saying maybe your soul is prepared for heaven at this point, but you're still going to die as a result of what you've done. And so that is the question there. For Furlong, it's almost easier because he's dead. For Norton, it's like, okay, well, now you have to live with this because all of your hatred has caused, from one death has caused another.
Yeah.
So therefore, how are you going to move on from that? And that's kind of the question that, like I said, thankfully the movie doesn't even desire to answer, and that the movie leaves it on the Gettysburg Address like kind of speech instead of leaving it very negative. It's like saying, like I said, it's a very peaceful ending to a movie.
Yeah, for actually what happened.
Right, which is actually to say, I think that it is a positive, like, oh no, well, but he still changed, even if it was.
But I mean, so much of the
briefly,
tragedy is that we're going to avoid Edward Furlong ever going quite down this path, and then that does not happen.
Didn't you feel, by the way, though, one thing I'd say negatively about all this too is that after Edward Norton tells his story to him, that he's immediately like, oh yeah, this is awful. There's no, that's just like a change that immediately happens. Like,
I mean, it's implied of what a huge influence he is on his life.
Yeah, and maybe even also how little he actually cared about or wanted to be a part of any of that.
Yeah,
and
that does happen quickly, though.
Right?
I will admit, I actually briefly thought of that and then kind of forgot it. But
if the movie had been a little longer, but then again, no, he didn't want that either. So
I just want to stress what a strange thing it is where a director actually wants a movie to be shorter than, because we hear often the opposite where they want it to be longer, and so it's fascinating that this is where it happened. Well, what do you think about this as a depiction of white supremacy? Obviously, in the 90s, there was obviously a lot of domestic terrorism that happened here in the United States. So this was something that was both probably novel to most Americans to see, the idea that neo-Nazism exists in such a big subcultural way. But at the same time, there were a lot of instances of domestic terrorism in the 90s that come, of course, from right-wing spaces. What did you think about this as far as its orientation of being in the 90s and being a depiction of that subculture?
Yeah. Well, obviously we've seen talk radio earlier in the decade at the very beginning, which is a lot about neo-Nazism. And
I think a lot of that movie. I think that movie is pretty good and underrated. It actually came out in 88.
Oh, okay. I thought it was late 80s.
I thought it was
early
late
90s.
80s, yeah. But
anyways, that was actually right after Wall Street, which, wow, what an improvement.
Yeah.
But, and I say this as an Oliver Stone fan, but dang. And Wall Street's fine, but actually the sequel's better, randomly. So, anyway. Yeah. That with talk radio, that had already been kind of a thing saying, hey, this thing is happening over here. And I know that was a big thing in the 70s and 80s, kind of the official sort of rise of neo-Nazism in America. But also in the 90s, you had versions of, obviously of the militia movement and kind of this I said, all these kind of more far-right ideas that aren't explicitly neo-Nazi. Like, you wouldn't say that the people of Ruby Ridge were, like, neo-Nazis.
But they inevitably support white supremacy and white separatism.
Right, and especially with Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City, and then also with, what's the guy's name that Atlanta?
Eric Rudolph?
Yeah, Eric Rudolph.
The Atlanta bombing.
And so versions of that have been happening that entire decade.
And then even right around the corner from this is the Columbine shooting, which is obviously connected in some sad way to white male rage.
And so, all that's to say there weren't these, like, explicit versions of that. Although the kind of reemergence of the KKK was really big in the 90s as well, that kind of went into the 2000s.
Yeah.
And because that feels like, to me, the last time that I really, really saw, at least in, not me personally, but in memory of, like, cultural significance, the Ku Klux Klan in this, like, I don't even want to say respectable, but, like, acknowledged space, like, where people were like, oh, well, the KKK, like, kind of thing.
And most Americans in polite society would, of course, say, that's objectable, but it was still there. It was still in the marketplace of ideas in its own way. Even to be at least respected in any way as a cultural institution, to have a space, like you said, is in its one way.
And also we had seen that in the 70s as well, and also, isn't there that part in The Godfather 3 where there's, like, the KKK people in it, but then they're, like, dressed up. They're actually, like, mafia people, but so, like, that, and then also Black Klansmen. So there were a lot of, like I said, versions of that and the first kind of big, some neo-Nazi rallies.
But again, a lot of that stuff was at the sides or the borders of American
So that's
culture.
what we're saying ultimately, is that even in the 90s, these big domestic terrorism and right-wing extremism and the militia movement were all in the same realm of that, obviously, but weren't explicitly that. But I will say the only other time more recently that we've seen the reemergence of the KKK was literally with Charlottesville, of all the...
also the right, the far right has taken on new groups and monikers.
Yes, so there's different, like the Proud Boys or whoever... and the militia movement is now just a normal thing, even more than even in the 90s when it was really becoming more concrete. That now it's just an almost accepted reality.
To the point where eventually January 6th is the thing that happens. And
because even with Waco, for example, that was something that was so definitive, the government saying you will not do this, and as many people have said, going too far in that instance of the government and of that. But you don't see that now. It's almost like, I won't say they kowtow to or kowtow to militias, but that's something that's just kind of like, well, whatever. Like, even before January 6th, you'd seen so many... We were talking about this, I know, years ago, me and you personally, about photographs of, like, militias in state houses, and like that just became a very normal sight of, like, these, burly men with AR-15s and bulletproof vests and caps and just standing in state houses protesting things. And that is even in any way acceptable on a public stage, which was not at all treated the same way as was the Black Panthers in the 70s, which was a very, like, no, with them carrying guns and stuff was, oh no, you can't do that. But this is just something that's like, oh yeah, that's just
almost
normal.
Like it's a white and black
That's what I'm
issue.
saying.
Yeah, right.
And so, like, that's just an accepted form of political dialogue
and
for whites, like,
protest as opposed to armed insurrection, which is what it is.
Which is when you see versions of even moderate versions of that with Antifa is, oh my god, they're taking over the country. And it's like, literally, as we've seen, and that literally Antifa were not the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. It was the Proud Boys, and it was the Oath Keepers, and it, all these far right militias that did all this and had all this planned. Whereas that's all to say that now that's a very more accepted reality. That even when we said, and I wrote about this I wrote that kind of comparison review of The Damned and Green Room. But our Green Room really opened that up in our eyes of that time.
And that had to be in 2016, right
before
Trump's
that,
election,
and even before a year later with Charlottesville. that all that's just to say this came at a time when it was more shocking to people, I think, to see this.
Yeah.
Whereas now, very sadly, that is the
more
reality. But now it does feel, at least to me, like that is a more out there, decried, more public abomination. Whereas at the time, it hid behind all this kind of like, well, you know, and they were able to, like I said, use the Rodney King riots and OJ and a lot of those things to their benefit to say, well, look at what happens, like, and it's a lot more of a kind of passive hate speech that is now not really in any way acceptable, even though it's more normalized.
I think it's well articulated and done, but one of the most hard to watch scenes in this movie is when they attack that Latino or Mexican American
it's
grocery
basically
store.
A Korean guy owns it,
right.
And he basically employs a lot of
that's right, yeah,
people that either are illegal or have green cards, but they don't care about.
That's just very hard to watch how they beat up and humiliate. That
reminded me a lot
visually
of Natural Born Killers, obviously with parts of that, but
yeah. How do you think this movie fits into the larger '90s political scene and stage of the era of Spike Lee, of Oliver Stone? I mean, in the '90s, there was a real hunger and desire by the public to consume these much more explicitly political movies, which, as you know, we look back on now and kind of see this golden age of mainstream political filmmaking. Not that they were all great, but the fact that the movies had a space to try and do
now
things
the
like
versions of that you have are Spotlight and The Post, which are so white bread,
investigative journalism
nothing.
Movies,
it's literally just like whatever. I mean, even a movie like Malcolm X, which is just literally telling the life story of the man, and the ending does give some like, oh, who I am Malcolm X, and does say
it has
Malcolm
direct
X
connections to Rodney King,
right, and does say that Malcolm X was a great man. Other than that, though, the movie simply just says this is Malcolm X, like you know.
And that in of itself was just seen as radical, even
right.
Then,
and so the fact that even happened, you could say the same thing. Also, I think the last movie I can think of that was a version of this was Che, the Soderbergh movie about Che, which I'm a big fan of. I love those movies, and they're great. The 2-part kind of movies.
Yeah.
And that he was criticized for not criticizing Che enough, and he just kind of shrugged and was like, I didn't see him as either this or that. I simply just made the movie, like, you know.
Yeah.
But I think he does a great job of that, in especially the first movie, of showing the communist insurgencies in Cuba, right, during the revolution. There's literally scenes where he's cutting between battle scenes of that and then Che Guevara speaking at the UN in the 60s, and this kind of very, like, aggressive rhetoric that he has, and almost showing the change in the person or the evolution of the person. And that in itself, I think, is a statement about Che Guevara, to just say, well, this is what he, you know, how is this person the same person, or was this the same person all along? Like, you don't ever get movies that ask those questions anymore, it seems like, and it's all very this or that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Green Room earlier, because that's a movie that I had a lot of affinity for when it first come out, and is for reasons both in the movie and not in the movie that it's harder for me to watch or care about as much. Is I feel like now the impulse would be to make something like this more of a genre movie, as opposed to kind of, I mean, this was characterized as a crime drama on the Wikipedia page, but I mean, this is a very conventional
There's
drama.
There's only a couple
in a variety
scenes
of ways.
of direct violence, though. It's not like a consistently,
I think it's just like the air of what it is hangs over the movie, as opposed to actually showing acts of violence, as you said, which usually, as always is the case, are not actually as bad or as frequent as the memory lasts. But I feel like to see a movie made like this now, it would more conventionally resemble a genre movie or a horror movie or a thriller, as opposed to digging into how and why. Because one thing I both respect about Green Room and think that sometimes it actually doesn't age the movie very well is that there's no real interest in trying to understand the people that are in this world.
And I wrote about it in my review about that it's a dual survival instinct ultimately, and whether that's even a good thing or not. I guess maybe to an extent that a lot of people would characterize that as modern and interesting cinematically, artistically. But I feel like with the stakes as high as they are now in terms of these things, that we need to at once empathize, understand, but also condemn these acts and these people who commit these acts. And I feel like really Green Room has a certain smugness about it. And also the part of the movie is that it's kind of counterpointing these punks who are almost by sheer definition part of the subculture in some way, and then also the Nazis or the fascists. I mean, it's literally the far left and the far right versions of the same movement, ultimately,
and that they're actually not as different as they would think they are, but they happen to be on wrong sides of the coin. Speaking of, another one of these things, too, if you needed to know, if you didn't know by already listening to everything about the neo-Nazism is bad, just look at their taste in music as absolute garbage. It's this garbage punk music that is
And I say this even as a fan of a good amount of punk music. Yeah, I mean, hate punk or Nazi
there are colors of punk. It's not all this.
That's just, there's nothing good about it. It doesn't even sound good. That's a lot more of a screamo kind of like version of punk that I don't like anyway. That's what's interesting about punk music to me, though, too, and is bad about it, is that it attracts, like you said, both versions of that same relatively similar bent.
It's both versions of people that are saying mainstream society needs to be rejected.
Yeah.
Now, on the left end of that, it's like anti-capitalist, anti-class, various divisions of sexuality or gender, some of which I agree with, but I would say
and racial divides
are taking it too far. Versus outright abject hatred, outright abject fascist mentality, and again, they both
a hateful anarchism is what I would call the kind of Nazi version of that. Is obviously fascism isn't anarchism,
but it's also calling for a certain sense of fascist order that is inherently not necessarily anarchism, even though they would also embrace such symbols.
Like I said, they would see, when I say that, I say more of like an anarchism towards the current government rather than the actual,
nonetheless revolutionary ideas. And so obviously, like I said, they think they're very different, but in reality, they're very. There's a certain similarity there.
And about Green Room, I think that the movie never, and let me say, the movie is clear who is the villain and who is the. But that's something that I kind of took the movie to task for, and I think it actually is a better movie than The Damned, which is a really pretty great movie too. That on a purely genre and aesthetic level, I think it's really great. But that something that I didn't like about it is that there are so many movies that actually neglect to reckon with fascism and Nazism of what it literally is. This movie actually does, now with American History X, to get back to that, and I'll continue to get back to that in a minute. It actually is saying, okay, but what about this on a personal level? Why do these people feel this way?
That's what I'm saying about as far as this depiction of causality. It's like, no, why does this one man think this way? And we're going to chart the history of this. And I thought taking these really big themes and making them personal, I think, is one of the big successes of the movie.
And why I think it is a great 90s political film, because the other ones are all about John F. Kennedy's death.
I was going to say that's
Malcolm X, or
it's
like
kind of taking these big institutional visions of things.
Yeah, or even Natural Born Killers being like, oh, well, it's about
society and media, and like
it becomes a cartoon, and so therefore, not that it doesn't have any social redeemability, but it doesn't apply in a way that this movie does.
Again, that's a similarity I think Menace to Society has to this, is that it's taken these big socio-political ideas, but personalizing them and making them about these specific characters.
Yeah, and a lot of people could watch Menace to Society from a racist point of view and say, oh, is all these gangs, is this all they do? But the Hugheses themselves are saying, no, there are choices that can be made here to make, and, there's the Muslim guy in the movie that is saying, no, you can do this, and you can be a different person, and so that is a great version of that movie that could easily have been, a lot of people probably walk away from that, certain people, thinking, all these gangs, and it's like, no, the Hughes themselves were saying, no, this doesn't have to be this way, and, like, even within, let's say, within black culture.
Yeah.
Whereas, I said other people I don't think would have been even smart enough to see it as that way. And that comes from a black perspective, obviously, as well. But anyway, with Green Room and I implicate a ton of World War II movies in this way too. They never actually want to reckon with what is Nazism as an ideology, which, like I said about The Damned, which is not a perfect movie, is literally that, is trying to say what is Nazism about and why. Now, it doesn't do that totally because the movie's also a lot about people, the people themselves and their lust for power. But the sequence I think about from that movie all the time is the Night of the Long Knives kind of segment where they're literally the SS is executing the SA basically, and that everyone there just looks like an animal. Like they literally don't even look like people. They're literally just killing each other, and they're just screaming or yelling or whatever, and it's all very primal. And that, like I said, you can see that from like I said, it sounds like I'm saying that from like I am about Green Room, of it's just about survival, but it really comes down to what are the hypocrisies of this belief system, and what are their basic tenets are represented in that scene, I think, of saying this is literally they agree with the same things, but then it all becomes about power anyway, and it's not really about anything, actually.
Yeah.
Whereas Green Room never even attempts to ask those questions. It's far more about, this is just a group of people that exist, and this is a group of people that exist. And it's far more of a treatise on what punk rock is as a political movement than as what Nazism is. Right. So anyway, that's all to say that's what I really love about American History X, is it actually personalizes what about fascism and white supremacy, of why do people actually believe that, what's the reason, what's, like you said, the causality of that.
And I think it's interesting, after everything I just kind of complained about with Green Room, I think it's actually still a superior movie to this.
Right, it is, yeah.
As far as filmmaking goes, and as far as maintenance of tone, because as I said, I think one of the flaws of this movie, which is overall pretty good, is that self-seriousness to the point of falling apart at some points. Right. And I think, obviously, Green Room is...
I mean, we will call this class...
American History X.
I mean, he told us.
Yeah, but anyway.
But again, it's crazy that you look back on... And we've talked about versions of what the 90s meant were over the course of this podcast, that... an era thought of so nostalgically in a popular sense, which is true of the 80s in a roundabout way. We've talked about that in the past. But the movie marketplace was really embracing radical ideas as far as and interrogating those radical political ideas during this time, and they were making money. I mean, JFK was like a pretty big hit.
Yeah.
Malcolm X did well. Spike Lee's career in general in the 90s was somewhere. Menace to Society did well. I mean, these movies did well pretty much financially, or were talked about in the culture. And I think we're just now so starved for that in the mainstream political sense, especially, do we not live in interesting times or something? No, we definitely do. And I think we're wondering, where are the movies about this stuff? I mean, where's the thoughts being exercised cinematically about the times we've been living through over the last 6 to 8 years? But
I have a lot of random kind of thoughts I wanted to throw in here at different points about different things. I'm going to try to, I guess if we're wrapping up here, more than likely. As far as that, about Los Angeles in the 90s, and we kind of talked about this, of Rodney King and OJ and all the riots that had happened. And we've said this before, that the 90s as kind of a violent... decade as a result of America turning, and not only America, but we've talked a lot about that outside of America, of, the Cold War being over and all the little minor war. Well, they weren't little for a lot of people, but I mean in the grand scheme of very smaller conflicts.
But it wasn't the realization of the Cold War. Yeah.
But then even in America, kind of not able to look outward towards enemies anymore, I think brewed a certain people looking back inward and kind of then these kind of racist attitudes being prevailed again in public spaces because of, oh, well, now we have to find another problem. And those kind of really civil rights issues that had been a lot more quiet after Martin Luther King's assassination and kind of the disillusion of the Black Panthers in the 70s, of that final, it kind of going dormant for a pretty long time, that was especially compounded by the war on drugs and in the 80s and the over-incarceration of African Americans by the Reagan administration.
But in his own way, Jesse Jackson, as a political candidate, was trying to be a voice for those things. Yeah,
but that all that, I feel like, resulted in this kind of overspilling of that in the 90s, because I think I've said this before, and this sounds like a random detail. When I think of the 90s in my head, the prevailing thought, or the image, I guess, is of like some summer street, and it's like and it looks it's like very at the end of the day, and it's very hot, and there's just police cars driving around. And I think, why is that's my prevailing memory of the 90s, which is not really a decade I grew up in. I grew up in the 2000s. And I think back to, because that was a sick kind of police state reality of America at the time, especially, I said, in Los Angeles. And like I said, we think even now, oh, we're kind of past that, sort of. But I literally just read there was a New York Times article that I think is very important that everybody should go read. That is about Albany High School in Albany, California, which is in the Bay Area, I think pretty close to Oakland and San Francisco. About a couple years ago, there was this, it was a pretty, affluent high school that was pretty racially diverse. I mean, there's a lot of white people that go there, but also some African Americans, and then especially an Asian community and some Latinos. That there was this private Instagram account that had been made, kind of started, that had all these very extremely racist posts and jokes that basically came out and kind of blew up, and there was only, I think, around a dozen people that were actually involved in it, but it was regarding a lot of people that went there. This was in 2017, by the way. I think I said that, but and that there was this whole backlash to that, and then there was a protest that happened, an attempt at mediation by the school district between the Instagram people and the victims of it, that literally devolved into basically what was going to become a mass riot, that actually did put the instigators in a danger that was not warranted. Of people were literally maybe going to beat them. Well, actually, that did happen to a couple people, got beat up. And that literally they sued the school district over that. I think it actually, one of those lawsuits, it said, just got to the Supreme Court this last season of it in June, and was denied on appeal of one of the people that was the instigators of the whole thing. But the whole story was just an incredibly, because I'm not going to both sides of the whole thing. It's clear that these people were doing these racist things, but the reaction of that by the school district was frankly abhorrent. And their attempts to mediate that situation just totally were very, very wrong, and a negative, totally corrosive situation that really, I mean, it literally divided the town. I really recommend going and reading the whole article, because it's something important, I think, especially that just happened a few years ago. And things like this, I think, we're sad to say, clearly have happened in the South.
Let me just say, the name of this is the Instagram account that shattered a California high school.
Yeah, it's actually technically from the New York Times Magazine.
Yeah.
But
and it had barely a dozen followers, but the discovery of its racist posts turned the Bay Area community against itself and changed students' lives forever.
And it's talked a lot about the and of course it talked about the people who did it, and then basically saying, well, I only followed it, or I only did this, and kind of trying to lack the culpability, and then the anger that spurned from that, and it was just literally a locus of just hatefulness all around, like I said, mainly on their parts, but also I think relatively righteous anger from the people who were wronged, but also one that didn't solve anything.
That's the thing about
either.
A fire, you can't control a fire ultimately.
Yeah.
It gets out of
literally
of,
go to the very bottom of that article and read that final quote, and it's literally what you're saying. Actually, is it not going to come up? Okay, I will find it really quickly. So you've got it now.
It was being annoying here.
Yeah, this is from, I think, one of the either assistant principals or one of the counselors at the school.
Back then, it felt as if she were, and talking about, I believe, Melissa
Fole,
middle of a conflagration. It was a fire line, she said, and so everybody was passing the buckets. Her eyes filled with tears at the recollection. Some of us, me included, accidentally picked up some gas. We didn't know it, right? We were just passing the bucket. And I'm sorry that it was gasoline. I didn't mean to do any harm. I tried to pick up plenty of buckets of water, but when I was moving so quickly like that, it all looked the same.
So literally what you just said is like I said, the fire just consumed that whole town. It was really unfortunate because a lot of the people were friends with each other and had known each other for years, and it was just a very complicated, really tragic whole episode of that town. And so that's all to say that I said we think about a movie like this and we think about things and we think, oh, that's so, the movie seems passe now to be like white supremacy is a problem, but then you still see stuff like this happen, and it's like, and I still feel like even this movie with all its problems, there really hasn't been a movie that could match this on the level of I said empathy and the kind of the personalness and the humanness of the story. It doesn't attempt to be too political in these broad senses, or even that a documentary would be.
Yeah,
it's able to actually make the people feel real, even when it does feel a little over the top.
I think visually one of the best moments of the movie is towards the very end, where after he's kind of expressed everything to his brother, and they just slowly go about taking off the walls, all the awful neo-Nazi imagery, and then you see the walls are empty. Literally, this is this whole kid's life and existence. There's nothing else on these walls other than this. And that, emptiness.
Yeah.
All right, now what? Now what am I going to replace this hate with? And the fact that consumed his whole life. And that he was on the path to being the next version of, who his older brother was. And so that I mean, it's kind of very quickly happens, but that's one of those images I saw that really illustrates the depth of hatred that this movie's attempting to try to shed light on and try to reform, is that how consuming it is as a phenomenon. So, pairing this with The Last Days of Disco, like I said, not the most two obvious choices, but as I said, I think they're actually...
This movie was obvious enough to not be the most obvious choice for those.
I think, Portraits of Whiteness, and that might immediately sound like it's an offense to Last Days of Disco, because it's very clearly not about this world.
Right, yeah.
And this level of intentional hate towards other people. But again, they're both about very white spaces and white worlds. Other than the moment when he goes to prison, then it's kind of a remark is made that you're the black person here, in prison, and how that in and of itself changed his mind. The idea that I'm going to get out of my comfort zone and go somewhere where I'm not the majority, and oh wow, it changed my perspective, as opposed to deepening it.
And then, of course, that's also thinking, well, if the whites are the majority in America, why am I a minority here? Says everything about that,
Absolutely.
Of minorities being in prison, over incarcerated.
So this is a movie that I think that we were both like, what's this going to be? And it's not perfect, but actually I think acquits itself fairly well in terms of aging.
It's actually pretty good.
Well, which I was pleasantly surprised.
There were a lot of really great, it was very great, a lot of great visuals. Let's see what they do with it. Moments. I talked about, there's a moment in the movie where he is jumped in the shower, and afterwards is literally laying there in the water, and the mist kind of fills the room and it kind of fades out. Is one of the greatest images I've seen in a movie in a while.
Right.
To just be randomly, at this point in the movie, and it being black and white, and that just looked really good. And so, yes, definitely, it's a movie that has a lot to say, but also is an effective filmmaking exercise too, I think, and actually is technically competent, which is not common among movies like this, I don't think, sometimes.
Yeah. So that does it for this episode of Overlapping Dialogue, but not only are we getting ready to do our, Jeff Probst is going to tell us what, 1999, Levi, that's our next year. That is a huge year.
99, what Barker got to with that one over.
And so actually, before we even talk about the movies next week, I actually want to spend time talking about 1999 as a film year because it's rightfully seen as one of the greatest film years ever. And
our two picks are not, one of them, I would say maybe... One of them is maybe one of the best, and one of them I don't think so. But so we didn't necessarily pick the best ones exactly. So that's something to note.
Yeah, I kind of specifically wanted to go with these two because of an idea that they loosely share in a roundabout way. But again, so in 1999, we've been building up to it. It's the final boss of the 90s. I mean, here we are. So Jeff Probst, what have we got next week?
Stay tuned for scenes from our next episode.
Instead of wasting your time interrogating me, we should be out there trying to figure out who did this.
Okay, Tracy. Who do you think did it? Whom should we interrogate?
Well, I don't know. It could have been anybody. There's a lot of subversive elements here at Carver. Like Rick Thiessen or Kevin Speck and those burnouts. Or what about Tammy Metzler? I mean, her whole thing is being anti-this and anti-that.
Tracy, you're a very intelligent girl. You have a lot of admirable qualities. But one day maybe you'll learn that being smart and doing whatever you need to do to get ahead, and yes, stepping on other people to get there, well, there's a whole lot more to life than that. And in the end, you're only cheating yourself.
Why are you lecturing me?
This isn't the time or the place to get into it. But there is, for just one example, a certain former colleague of mine who made a very big mistake, a life mistake. Now, I think the lesson here is that old or young, we all make mistakes. And we have to learn that our actions, all of them, can carry serious consequences.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what you're referring to, but maybe if certain older, wiser people hadn't acted like such little babies and gotten so mushy, then everything would be okay.
I agree. And I also think that certain young and naive people need to thank their lucky stars and be very, very grateful that the entire school didn't find out about certain indiscretions that could have ruined their reputations and their chances to win certain elections.
And I think certain older people, like you and your colleague, shouldn't be leching after their students, especially when some of them can't even get their own wives pregnant. And they certainly shouldn't be making slanderous accusations, especially when certain young, naive people's mothers are paralegal secretaries at the city's biggest law firm and have won many successful lawsuits. And if you want to keep questioning me like this, I won't continue without my attorney present.
I need that super smiley with cheese, ASAP!
You need more than that, my little hombre.
Oh, yeah. What's good here? Nothing. Oh, well, then I guess we'll just have to be bad, won't we? I'll have a double smiley sandwich, curly fries, and a vanilla shake.
Make that too.
That'll be $7.98. Please drive up to the window. Thank you.
I think we deserve a little junk food after the workout we had this morning. Do you know that?
Thank you, I'm flattered.
Smile, you're at Mr. Smiley's. Would you like to try our new beef and cheese pot pie on a stick? Just $1.99 for a limited time only?
We were just at a seminar. Buddy, this is my...
Her husband. We've met before, but something tells me you're going to remember me this time.
Whoa. You are so busted. You know, this really doesn't concern you.
Well, actually, Janine is senior drive-thru manager, so you kind of are on her turf. So, this makes sense.
Oh, Lester.
Honey, it's okay. I want you to be happy. Would you like smiley sauce with that?
Lester, just stop it!
No. You don't get to tell me what to do. Ever again.
So sadly, this is the Matthew Broderick film that is not the "why don't you just take over the bank, why don't you?" But
why don't you just take over the school, why don't you?
Well,
Election
that was her plan.
From 1999, as well as American Beauty from 1999.
One has aged well. One.
Yeah, so we'll start with Election and then American Beauty, and then I want to talk about something they might share kind of in a more broader way. Election, I think Barack Obama said this was his favorite movie about politics, which I think is like kind of like, wait, really? But I mean, this movie is.
Imagine him laughing and
statement.
giggling at the fed up moment, but yeah.
But it is a great depiction of not only politics, but high school. I mean, specifically, I mean, and not every high school experience necessarily, but like, I'd say this is subtly one of the best high school movies ever made. Of course, follows Tracy Flick, who is this kind of Reese Witherspoon, a young Reese Witherspoon, is this kind of type A personality, go-getter, going to be the class president. I mean, or trying to be class president, but just overall awesome student and individual, that just has everything going for her. And her rivalry with Matthew Broderick's character as a teacher, which I think is one of Matthew Broderick's best movies as well.
And it should be noted, the reason for his part of the rivalry is the fact that he sees the whole thing as, she derailed my teacher friend's life because they had this affair or whatever, and it's like, well, he shouldn't have done that,
adult,
right? So so that's a very important part of the movie that I think people sometimes forget or neglect, is that you're supporting a really bad person. But anyway,
so they are the two main characters.
Yeah.
But what I love about the movie, and the more you watch it, the more you pick up on it, is all the supporting cast that kind of surrounds them. Whether it be like the silent janitor who secretly destroys Broderick at the end of the movie, or whether it be
the football player or his sister.
Idiot, so I just think this movie has just a rich cast of characters that I guess this is our first Alexander Payne movie we'll be doing on the pod. I'm a huge fan of him, and I think this is Sideways. I think is probably his best movie, but this is like way up there as far as among his strongest work. And I think there's a reason why Reese Witherspoon became a star. Is this is one of those star-making early roles for her that I think Tracy Flick is such a dense character, and I want us to talk about her a lot next week because I think there's a lot to talk about with that character in terms of the extent to which the movie roots for and against her, because I think that's an important thing to understand about the movie and changes, and in many ways too. And the movie ends on this note of drawing direct parallels between her and Monica Lewinsky, who of course was a huge figure in the late 90s due to the Lewinsky situation with Bill Clinton. Any other thoughts for Election? Previewing it before we...
No, I really love that. I think it's a really great movie, and I've only seen a few Alexander Payne movies, but it's my favorite one. And
American Beauty.
We also will probably... Sorry, before we get to that, we'll probably have a lot of specific opinions about it as teachers, too. And we'll talk about that.
Oh, well, we've made reference to it on this podcast before. I don't remember when it was, of like... the three branches of government.
And it's just like him teaching it over and over.
And there's been a time or two where I've been teaching civics, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm Matthew Broderick in Election.
And you're like, well, I think, but no, I mean, that's just a natural part of that, but the kids change, not that, and that's what it's all about. So, because guess what? Most stuff in curriculums don't change. So,
American Beauty, also from 1999. This has...
You know what, thankfully did change is people's opinion of Kevin Spacey, because that needed to happen. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm gonna come out here red hot, and I'm gonna say a very hot take. Are you ready? Kevin Spacey's actually great in this movie. Not only is he actually great, I think he has slightly become underrated as an actor. But what sorts of characters does he usually play? He plays scumbags, he plays liars, he plays degenerates. Now, we can go ahead and make the quick and obvious joke, oh, well, that's because he was one, and you know what? Probably so. But he plays characters like this in a way that is frankly unparalleled. I think to the point, like I said, he seemed like an awful human being behind the scenes, so I'm not trying to say he's actually a great person, but like he actually there's a time where he had this type of character cornered.
Yeah.
That market cornered, and he was just the best actor to do this. And this is the ultimate portrait of pathetic white male again. Ineptitude, nepotism, arrogance about why isn't everything in life all about me? And that's subtly what the whole movie's about. I mean, the movie is kind of the midlife crisis movie of this era. There's a lot of, I think, similarities between this and Lolita as well. Obviously, the Stanley Kubrick movie from many years before. This is kind of one of the iconic late 90s movies that has entered a weird space, not even since the Kevin Spacey allegations, which certainly contributed, but I think even before and after that, has become a movie that is often seen as overrated, and it got, made a lot of money for when it came out. It won a lot of Oscars. Sam Mendes, I was even reading, and this is his first movie, which was shocking that anybody can come out the gate and make a movie that's this big of a hit. And he's made better movies since then, don't get me wrong. But he even said, it was kind of natural for this. He said, I thought it was actually getting too much praise when it came out. He even said that. So even the director himself has kind of taken issue with the identity of this movie. Yeah,
and it's important to note this movie I think of far more as an Alan Ball project than as Sam Mendes project, because obviously, and it has a visual similarity heavily to 6 Feet Under. I think a lot about, and kind of that late 90s, early 2000s weird manicured decay almost, and so that's, and obviously it has some homosexual undertones, which, and obviously Alan Ball being a homosexual, that's part of that. But I think about this, like I said, as a and I feel that probably Alan Ball might even see this as a stepping stone to make something like 6 Feet Under or True Blood, or
I had to add to how that even got greenlit as things. I mean, Academy Award-winning screenwriter of American Beauty.
Yeah, well, the moroseness of even making a TV show that's about a funeral home just kind of is really, you're going to do that? Only could have really happened from this, and so But.
So I'm not trying to say this movie's actually a masterpiece, because I don't actually think that. However, as someone who loves and is obsessed with flawed dramas, this is the cream of the crop of flawed. I mean, this is literally on the Mount Rushmore of flawed dramas.
Yeah.
And as far as movies that kind of have a bloated sense of self or import, but it actually, I mean, a lot of people see that as kind of a flaw, and it kind of is, but at the same time, that's a reflection of this character having a bloated sense of importance. So I think weirdly, it's bloated self of importance actually kind of works because of the perspective and the point of view.
Yeah, I mean,
it has. Also, the poster for this movie was iconic in the late 90s. I remember seeing this in movie theaters, and the sense of kind of weird mystery of what even is this movie?
Yeah.
I remember being something that as a young man captivated me. I didn't see this till much later. I think I was in college. But again, another thing too was this was DreamWorks, kind of part of its larger origin story in terms of it being the first massive, I think along the same Private Ryan, big hits of the studio. So again, this is a movie that's fraught with look at the themes and analysis section for this movie too. So wow, that's actually even bigger than I thought. I think it's, people make a mistake totally shortchanging this movie and totally acting like it doesn't matter or who cares or it's overrated. I think that kind of underrates actually its flaws and actually why it's still captivating to me personally. I know that might be a random thing to say, and I know there's people right now shouting saying this is the movie you picked from 1999 when there's Fight Club and Magnolia and
when there's when there's Fight Club. Please,
I'm not even a huge fan of that movie. That is an undeniably sophisticated
it
movie,
is. I'm just saying, it's funny they'd be like, you're not doing Fight Club.
Or being John Malkovich, another. I mean, I want us to talk about 1999, The Matrix, even episode 1, as far as a cultural phenomenon. So I mean, the list goes on.
Because they easily could have just done a Tom Cruise-a-thon and done Eyes Wide Shut and Magnolia, but you know.
So I want us to talk about 1999 as a general film year because there's a lot of big stuff to talk about, and there's been books actually literally even written about just that year of film. So I wanted to pick these two movies specifically because I think they're great conclusions to the 90s in terms of depictions of the Clinton era and in terms of a social, cultural, what that era, quote, meant. I feel like these two movies have aged to be really important Clinton era works of the time capsules of their eras, I guess you could say, in different ways. And again, I'm sure there's people objecting to American Beauty even being picked here, but again, we're going to revisit this movie, and I might actually have more contempt for it now than I had years ago, and there's actually good, but I think even that is going to be something worth talking about and being interested in.
Yeah, I saw it years ago, and I just didn't really have an opinion of it either way, so I've never really cared about it.
It's actually one of the most contentious movies you could talk about
I know.
Of this era. So
I do think a lot about the whole, like, the video of the plastic bag. It's like, what's funny about that movie is it now has a whole second life and legacy of Jamie Dutton being in it, and it's like of him being that, like.
Well, I thought you were even going to say the Katy Perry song "Firework," like, do you?
Or that,
like a plastic bag.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
But we're going to get into all that next time, and the 90s will be over.
Yeah. And then what the hell are we going to do with ourselves? Well, we
already got an idea.
Like F. Jasmine in the member of the wedding, we had plans.
Yeah.
So.
This is Kyle.
This is Levi.
Take care. God bless.
American history.